Hey guys, tonight we're stepping off the beaten path, away from the well-trodden sands of Egypt and the familiar clay tablets of Mesopotamia. We're heading deep into the lush, ancient heart of West Africa, a place where whispers of forgotten knowledge still rustle in the leaves and the scent of natural pigments hangs heavy in the air. You're going to explore systems of writing so unique, so deeply tied to the very earth they were written on, that many faded from memory, etched only into the collective unconscious. Let's be real, trying to stay awake through 15,000 words on this? You probably won't survive this journey conscious, and that's okay, that's the goal. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're up for it, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. Let's see how far around the world our sleepy little history class reaches tonight. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing at the edge of a dense green forest, the air thick with humidity and the scent of damp earth and unseen blossoms. Sunlight filters down in dappled patterns, illuminating paths barely visible beneath tangled vines. This isn't the arid landscape you might first picture when thinking of ancient history and writing. This is a place of vibrant life, of buzzing insects, chattering monkeys, and the distant calls of birds you've never heard before. It's a place where history wasn't always carved into stone or baked into clay, but often lived and breathed, passed down through intricate performances, rhythmic drumming, and yes, through symbols and scripts that told stories just as complex, just as vital as any scroll in a dusty library. We tend to think of West Africa's history primarily through its powerful oral traditions, and rightly so. The griots, the storytellers and historians, held libraries in their minds, preserving generations of knowledge, lineage, and lore with incredible accuracy. But alongside this rich spoken world there existed, and in some cases still exist, written traditions. They might not have been used for bureaucracy on the same massive scale as, say, the cuneiform records of Sumer, or for widespread public decrees like Roman inscriptions. Instead, they often served different purposes: spiritual, ceremonial, personal, sometimes even secret. Imagine walking deeper into this forest, the sounds of the canopy softening the outside world. You might pass a shrine, not carved from marble, but built from packed earth, adorned with woven fabrics and perhaps, just perhaps, marked with strange symbols painted onto a wooden board or a piece of bark. These aren't just random doodles, they are deliberate marks, carrying meaning, connecting the visible world to the unseen, binding the present to the past. These are the whispers of forgotten voices, the remnants of textual systems that developed independently or semi-independently in specific communities, serving their specific needs. The narrative we often get is that writing came to West Africa primarily with the arrival of Islam, bringing Arabic script, or later with Europeans bringing the Latin alphabet. And while those scripts certainly became influential and widespread, the idea that literate culture began with external influence is, frankly, a bit of historical malpractice. It's like saying agriculture started everywhere with the Romans bringing ploughs, completely ignoring millennia of local innovation. West Africa was a dynamic region with complex societies, sophisticated trade networks stretching across the Sahara. That's a mainstream historical fact for you. The trans-Saharan trade routes were bustling highways of commerce and ideas for centuries, connecting West Africa to North Africa and the wider Mediterranean world, and vibrant cultural practices long before large-scale contact with these external forces. It stands to reason that some of these societies would develop their own ways of recording information, thought, and belief. And they did. But these systems were often vulnerable. They might be tied to specific guilds, religious groups, or royal courts. Their materials were often perishable. We'll talk a lot about ink and surfaces later. But think about writing on leaves, bark, or even temporary surfaces like sand or body paint. Not exactly built for archival longevity, are they? Try leaving your crucial business records on a banana leaf outside for a week in the rainy season. It's not going to end well for your quarterly reports. This ephemeral nature is one major reason why much of this textual history is forgotten or underappreciated. Unlike the monumental stone inscriptions of ancient Egypt or the vast libraries of cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamia, the physical evidence is scarce. Archaeological digs might turn up pottery shards, tools, or building foundations, but organic materials like treated bark scrolls or painted calabashes simply don't survive millennia in the tropical climate. It's like trying to reconstruct the history of sticky notes from only finding the pens used to write on them. Good luck with that. Another factor, and a pretty significant one we'll dive into later, was deliberate suppression and marginalization during the colonial era. When European powers carved up the continent, they often prioritized their own languages and scripts, viewing indigenous systems as primitive, irrelevant, or even subversive. Education systems were established using European languages, and the use of local scripts declined, sometimes rapidly. Imagine being told your way of writing is cute, maybe nice for doodles, but not suitable for, important stuff like laws or commerce or history. It's a pretty effective way to encourage people to stop using it. But the knowledge didn't always vanish entirely. It often retreated, becoming more localized, more specialized, sometimes even secret, passed down within families or among members of a particular society or craft. This brings us to a quirky little tidbit. Some of these writing systems weren't primarily about writing language, as we understand it, strings of sounds or words, but about communicating ideas or concepts directly through symbols. Think of them more like complex visual codes or mnemonic devices, deeply embedded within a specific cultural context. It wasn't necessarily about transcribing speech, but about conveying meaning in a condensed symbolic form. Imagine leaving a message for your friend that isn't "meet me by the big tree," but instead you draw a symbol for meeting, a symbol for person, and a symbol for large plant. If they understand the code, they get the message. If not, they just see some interesting pictures. This makes deciphering them tricky, especially when the context is lost. This leads us nicely into an open scholarly debate. To what extent were these indigenous West African scripts and symbol systems influenced by external writing systems like Arabic or even ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs via long-distance connections, versus being purely indigenous inventions? Historians still argue whether certain scripts show faint echoes of outside influence, perhaps picked up along those trans-Saharan trade routes we mentioned, or if they sprang entirely from local soil, driven by the unique needs and creative minds of the communities that developed them. The truth is likely a complex mix, but the degree of external influence versus internal innovation is a fascinating puzzle that keeps researchers busy. So, as you drift deeper into this imagined historical landscape, leave behind your assumptions about what writing should look like, what materials it should be on, or what purpose it should serve. Here, writing might appear on a carved wooden mask, a piece of pottery, the wall of a house, or woven into a textile. It's not always about recording history for future generations in a library. Sometimes it's about communicating a spiritual message in the moment, marking ownership, documenting initiation into a secret society, or preserving knowledge about medicinal plants. The concept of literacy itself might need adjusting. It wasn't necessarily about mass reading and writing like in a modern society, but about understanding and utilizing specific symbol systems within particular cultural spheres. Think about the sounds around you, the rustle of leaves, the distant sound of a drum, perhaps the rhythmic pounding of something being prepared. This environment is the backdrop for the creation and use of these scripts and inks. The materials for writing weren't bought at a stationery store. They were harvested from the forest, extracted from the earth, or collected as a byproduct of daily life. The ink might come from crushed berries, charcoal mixed with binding agents, or even iron-rich mud. The pens might be simple reeds, sharpened in sticks, or brushes made from natural fibers. Every act of writing was intimately connected to the local environment. You're settling down now, feeling the softness of the earth beneath you, listening to the night sounds of this ancient forest. We've just scratched the surface of why these systems are less known, hinting at their fragile nature, the impact of external forces, and their unique purposes. But understanding that they existed in this rich and varied landscape is the first step. It challenges the often Eurocentric view of writing's history and opens up a whole new chapter of human innovation and communication that's been waiting patiently in the shadows, like a forgotten symbol hidden among the leaves. We've set the stage. Now, as you get even more comfortable, perhaps even nodding off, we'll start to look at some specific examples of these remarkable forgotten voices and the earthy inks that gave them life. As you rest here, the sounds of the forest around you seem to soften, becoming less like noise and more like a gentle hum. Imagine the air growing cool as dusk settles, the vibrant greens of the leaves turning to deep, mysterious shadows. In certain corners of this vast landscape, particularly in the southeastern part of what is now Nigeria, near the Cross River, history wasn't always shouted from the rooftops or carved into sturdy monuments. It was often whispered, drawn, or painted in places few outsiders ever saw. This is where we encounter Nsibidi. Just saying the name feels a bit mysterious, doesn't it? Nsibidi. It's a system of graphic symbols that has been used for centuries, primarily by various ethnic groups in the Cross River region, including the Efik, Ijagam, Igbo, and others. Now, when you picture writing, you probably think of letters forming words, like the script you're reading right now, or perhaps hieroglyphs lined up neatly in rows. Nsibidi is different. It's more like a vocabulary of signs and symbols, some abstract, some looking a bit like stick figures or familiar objects that could be combined in various ways. Imagine attending a meeting, but not in a stuffy conference room. You're perhaps in a secluded clearing, the air thick with the scent of burning wood or fragrant leaves. The people communicating here aren't just talking, they're making gestures, drawing symbols on the ground with a stick, or pointing to marks painted on calabashes or carved onto wooden staffs. This visual language, Nsibidi, could convey complex ideas, proverbs, stories, even judicial rulings. A mainstream historical fact here is that Nsibidi was closely associated with secret societies, perhaps the most famous being the Ekp Society, often called the Leopard Society. These were powerful organizations, especially historically, involved in governing, enforcing laws, and maintaining social order within their communities. Nsibidi served as a form of communication among initiated members, a way to share messages, record transactions, like fines or debts, or document initiation rites without needing to speak openly or use a script accessible to everyone. It was a bit like having a private group chat centuries before smartphones, except instead of emojis and acronyms, you had stylized drawings and abstract shapes. And trust me, understanding their symbols for "you owe me a goat" or "watch out, the chief is grumpy today" was probably way more important than deciphering modern corporate jargon. The uses of Nsibidi were remarkably diverse, given its often esoteric nature. You could find Nsibidi symbols used as warnings placed on paths or objects, declaring something taboo or owned. They were incorporated into the designs of masks, textiles, and wall paintings, conveying layers of meaning to those who could read them. Some accounts even describe Nsibidi being used in love letters, though one can only imagine the potential for misinterpretation there. Did they draw a broken heart or a really sad-looking bird? The fate of our relationship hangs in the balance. One of the biggest challenges, both historically and for modern scholars, is that Nsibidi wasn't standardized across all communities or even all users. The meaning of a symbol could change depending on the context, the society using it, or even the individual. This isn't like learning the alphabet where A is generally A no matter who writes it, unless their handwriting is truly abysmal, in which case good luck to everyone. With Nsibidi, the interpretation relied heavily on shared knowledge and cultural background. This fluidity is part of its genius, allowing for nuance and layers of meaning. But it's also why trying to create a simple dictionary is incredibly difficult, if not impossible. You might see Nsibidi drawn with white chalk, called esun, which is made from clay or limestone, giving a crisp, bright line against a dark surface. Or perhaps with dark charcoal or plant-based pigments. The materials were often temporary, drawn on the ground for a fleeting message, painted on body for a ritual, or marked on perishable items. This brings us back to our earlier point about why so much of this history is hard to trace. The records were often literally washed away by the rain or faded by the sun. It's like trying to study the history of sandcastles, fascinating, but the primary sources tend to disappear rather quickly. A quirky or fringe tidbit about Nsibidi is that some accounts mention it being drawn on human skin, specifically as scarification or tattoos, or even painted onto fingernails. Imagine having a message or symbol etched onto your body or fingertips, permanent or semi-permanent form of communication or identity marker. This wasn't just ink on paper, it was ink or pigment or scar on living skin, carrying meaning that was quite literally deeply ingrained. While tattooing and scarification traditions exist widely, using them to deploy elements of a symbolic script adds another layer of complexity to how these systems functioned, beyond mere decoration. It suggests Nsibidi wasn't just a tool for external messaging, but could be part of personal identity, status, or spiritual connection. This leads us directly into an open scholarly debate. Is Nsibidi a true writing system in the linguistic sense, meaning it represents spoken language, or is it primarily a system of ideographs or pictographs that convey ideas directly? independent of specific words. Historians and linguists still argue whether Nsibidi symbols ever consistently mapped onto the sounds or words of a particular language like Efik or Ijagam. Some scholars believe there might have been phases where it moved closer to representing linguistic elements, perhaps developing into a form of logography where symbols represent words, while others maintain its core function remained conceptual and symbolic, relying on shared cultural understanding rather than linguistic transcription. The truth is complex, likely involving different uses and interpretations over time and across groups, making a definitive classification tricky. It's a bit like debating if a complex set of road signs is a language. It conveys information, but it doesn't let you write poetry or order a pizza, unless there's a very specific sign for pepperoni. Think about the skills required to use Nsibidi effectively. It wasn't just about drawing the symbols, it was about knowing which symbol to use in which context, understanding the potential layers of meaning, and being initiated into the knowledge of the secret society that governed its use. This wasn't mass literacy. It was specialized, perhaps even elite, knowledge. It reinforced the power structures within the societies that used it, creating a visual and symbolic bond among members that excluded outsiders. Imagine trying to understand the inside jokes and coded language of a tightly knit group. Nsibidi was like that, but on a much more profound cultural and social level. The symbols themselves can range from simple geometric shapes to more complex depictions of hands, feet, or human figures in various postures, often interacting. Some might represent abstract concepts like love, hate, war, or union. Others might depict specific actions or events. The challenge is that a symbol that looks like a hand might not always mean hand. In a different context, it could mean giving, receiving, power, or even stop. It's the ultimate game of Pictionary, except the rules are secret and change depending on who you're playing with. The study of Nsibidi has relied heavily on the accounts of early European visitors, missionaries, and colonial administrators who observed its use, as well as the memories and traditions of local people. However, these external accounts are often filtered through the observer's own biases and misunderstandings, and the internal knowledge, tied to those secret societies, was often deliberately kept hidden. This makes reconstructing its full history and usage patterns incredibly difficult. It's like trying to learn about a company's internal operations by only reading their public press releases and asking people who got fired. You'll get some information, but definitely not the full picture. Despite the challenges, the existence of Nsibidi is powerful. It demonstrates an indigenous, complex system of visual communication that existed and evolved independently in West Africa. It wasn't an alphabet borrowed from somewhere else. It was a system born from the cultural, social, and spiritual needs of the people who created it. Even though its widespread active use declined with the rise of other scripts and the disruption of traditional societies, Nsibidi symbols haven't entirely vanished. You can still find echoes of them in contemporary art, design, and cultural identity in the region, a quiet reminder of a sophisticated visual language that thrived for centuries. As you settle further into the darkness, imagine tracing one of these ancient Nsibidi symbols with your fingertip, perhaps a zigzag line representing a river, or a stylized figure indicating a personal spirit. Feel the texture of the imagined surface, whether it's smooth bark, rough cloth, or damp earth. Think about the hands that drew these symbols, the minds that conceived their meanings, and the secrets they helped to keep. This system, so tied to the specific cultural context and often ephemeral materials, is a perfect example of the kind of hidden textual traditions we're exploring tonight. Rich, complex, and waiting in the shadows of history. The intricate, often fleeting symbols of Nsibidi, etched onto surfaces that might crumble or fade now from your mind's eye, replaced by the image of a different kind of creation. Picture yourself not amidst the humid forest near the Cross River, but further west, across swaths of diverse landscapes and cultures, arriving now in what is present-day Liberia. The air here might feel different, perhaps a bit drier inland, or thick with the scent of the ocean closer to the coast. The sounds too shift, maybe the calls of different birds, the rustle of palm leaves, the distant rhythm of drumming. In this region, among the Vai people, something truly remarkable happened. Unlike Nsibidi, which evolved over time within the structures of secret societies, another script emerged in a more deliberate, focused burst of creativity. This is the story of the Vai script itself. It's a narrative that blends the practical needs of communication with something that feels almost magical. Imagine you are settling down after a long day, perhaps by a fire crackling softly, the flames casting dancing shadows on the walls of a hut. You're tired, your thoughts drifting. This is the state in which, according to tradition, a man named Momolu Duwalu Bukele found himself around the 1830s. Legend has it that he had a powerful dream. In this dream, a tall, venerable white man appeared to him and instructed him to create a system of writing for his people, the Vai. The dream figure supposedly showed him the shapes of characters, urging him to remember them and share them. Now, having a dream tell you to invent a writing system sounds like something out of a fantasy novel, doesn't it? It's a far cry from sitting in a committee meeting trying to agree on font choices. Yet this is the core of the traditional origin story. Bukele, upon waking, is said to have been profoundly affected by this vision. He gathered together a group of his kinsmen, 8 men are usually mentioned, and they embarked on the task of developing this new script based on what Bukele had seen and instructed. Think about the sheer audacity of this undertaking. No existing model from their immediate neighbours served as a clear template. They weren't adapting Arabic script, which had some presence through trade and religion, or Latin script, which was slowly making inroads via coastal interactions. They were starting largely from scratch, or at least synthesizing ideas in a completely novel way, specifically for the Vai language. This group, reportedly meeting in a place called Jondu, worked tirelessly. Some versions of the story say they locked themselves away for days, intensely focused on the task, the shapes from the dream slowly taking form on paper or leaves. The fact that a small group of individuals intentionally set out to create a writing system for their language, rather than borrowing or slowly evolving one over centuries, is quite unusual in human history. Most writing systems develop incrementally, or are adapted from existing ones. The Vai script is one of those rare examples of what linguists call a stimulus diffusion, or potentially even an independent invention influenced by the idea of writing, perhaps from seeing Arabic or Latin, but not directly borrowing the forms of the characters. This deliberate collective effort is a mainstream historical fact, supported by multiple early accounts and oral traditions among the Vai people. The names of at least some of these 8 collaborators are still remembered today, though Bukele remains the central figure. The system they created was not an alphabet where symbols represent individual sounds like A, B, C, nor was it purely pictographic or ideographic like some interpretations of Nsibidi. Instead, they invented a syllabary. In a syllabary, each symbol represents an entire syllable, a consonant followed by a vowel, like ba, ki, mo. This makes a lot of sense for languages like VA, where syllables are the fundamental building blocks of words. Instead of needing hundreds or thousands of characters, like in some logographic systems, or trying to figure out consonant clusters with an alphabet, you only need a symbol for each possible syllable in the language. For Vai, this turned out to be a manageable number, somewhere around 200 and 300 characters initially, though it's simplified over time. Imagine learning to read and write with a syllabary. You see a symbol, and it doesn't just mean B, it means Bei. You see another symbol, it means Li. Put them together, and you get Behli. It's a different way of mapping sound to symbol, one that can feel quite intuitive once you grasp the system, especially if your language has a relatively simple syllable structure. It's like learning a secret code, but instead of letters, each symbol is a little sound package. The quirky or fringe tidbit here ties back to that dream origin. While it's a powerful and widely accepted part of Vai oral tradition, what exactly was the nature of that dream? Was it a literal divine instruction? Was it a metaphor for a flash of creative insight that occurred during a liminal state between waking and sleeping? Historians and anthropologists still grapple with how to interpret such origin myths. Was there perhaps a real, albeit non-supernatural encounter that was later reinterpreted through the lens of a dream? Or could it have been a particularly vivid, perhaps even lucid dream that genuinely provided the initial inspiration and a framework for the creators? The persistence of the dream narrative across different accounts suggests it's crucial to the story, even if its precise nature remains open to interpretation. It's a reminder that the lines between history, memory, and myth are often beautifully blurred, especially when recounting the origins of something so significant. Early materials for writing with the Vai script were simple and readily available. You weren't going to the stationery store for fancy paper and pens. People wrote on leaves, bark, or smooth pieces of wood using ink made from crushed leaves, berries, or charcoal mixed with water or plant sap. Think about the smell of that ink, earthy, maybe a little sweet from the berries staining your fingers as you carefully drew each symbol. These were not permanent records meant to last for millennia carved in stone. They were practical documents, letters, notes, perhaps recording historical events or proverbs on materials that would eventually decompose or fade. This practicality, this use of ephemeral materials, is another common thread we see in many indigenous writing traditions in regions like West Africa, often making archaeological discovery challenging. Historians still argue whether the Vai script was truly an entirely independent invention, or whether the creators had some exposure to other writing systems that provided the idea of writing, even if they didn't copy the forms. The proximity to areas where Arabic literacy existed, and later, coastal contact with Europeans using Latin script, means the Vai people were aware that writing was possible. However, the structural differences between Vai, a syllabary, and Arabic or Latin, alphabets suggest a truly novel creation, rather than a simple adaptation. The debate isn't about whether Bukele and his group created the script. That's generally accepted. It's about the degree to which they were influenced by the concept of writing gleaned from observing other systems. It's a classic case of inspiration versus outright copying, and pinning down the exact nature of that creative spark centuries later is notoriously difficult. Once created, the Vai script began to be used, though not immediately by everyone. Its adoption spread gradually. Early accounts from European visitors in the mid-19th century noted its existence and use, often expressing surprise at finding an indigenous script in the region. Missionaries particularly became interested, seeing it as a potential tool for translating the Bible into the Vai language. This interaction, while leading to valuable documentation of the script, also brought external influences and pressures. Imagine the challenges of learning this new script in the 1830s or 1840s. No textbooks, no online tutorials, no helpful apps. You would learn by sitting with someone who knew it, perhaps one of the original 8 or someone they had taught. You'd watch their hand as they drew the symbols, practicing on leaves or in the sand, feeling the frustration when you got a stroke wrong or forgot what a particular symbol represented. It was a face-to-face transmission of knowledge woven into the social fabric of the community. It wasn't like a modern classroom where everyone gets the same worksheet. It was a more organic, personalized learning process, dependent on finding a willing teacher. The content written in early Vai script included letters between individuals, historical accounts passed down orally and now being recorded, genealogies, and even some early attempts at literature. There are fascinating examples of correspondence written in Vai script, tucked away in archives, revealing glimpses into the daily lives, concerns, and thoughts of Vai people in the 19th and early 20th centuries, things they chose to record in their own script, in their own voice. This wasn't just about practical communication. It was about preserving knowledge and identity. The journey of the Vai script wasn't always smooth. Like in Sibadi, its use faced challenges. The increasing dominance of English and Arabic literacy in the region through education and administration, the disruptions caused by colonial rule and later civil conflict, and the inherent difficulties of producing materials in a unique script, all played a role in its decline in widespread everyday use over the 20th century. It's tough to compete when the language of power and commerce is written in a different script, right? Trying to get official documents written in Vai script in a colonial administration would be like trying to pay for your groceries today using bartering and interpretive dance. Probably not going to work. Despite these challenges, the Vai script has shown remarkable resilience. Unlike some other scripts that have faded entirely into history, the Vai script continues to be known and used by some Vai people today, though perhaps not as universally as in its heyday. There have been efforts in recent decades to revitalize its use, teach it in communities, and even adapt it for digital use, including creating fonts so it can be typed on computers and phones. This ongoing effort is a testament to the pride and cultural significance the Vai people place on their unique writing system. It's a living heritage, even if its pulse is fainter than it once was. As you listen to the sounds of the night settling around you, think about Momolu Duwalu Bukele and his dream. Think about the small group of men working together, painstakingly creating symbols from scratch, each one a little vessel for a syllable, a sound package waiting to be filled with meaning. Imagine the first time someone successfully read a message written in Vai script, the symbols unlocking the spoken word, connecting minds across distance. It was a profound achievement born from inspiration, necessity, and dedicated effort, leaving a unique mark on the history of writing in West Africa. Leaving behind the narrative of the Vai script and its dream-inspired origins in Liberia, you now find yourself journeying west again, across shared borders and through diverse landscapes until you arrive in the region known today as Sierra Leone. The air might feel heavier here, closer to the coast perhaps, or thicker with the scent of tropical vegetation inland. The sounds might shift too, maybe the distinctive calls of different birds echoing through the trees, or the distant rhythm of different languages being spoken. You're entering the heartland of the Menda people. It's here, relatively recently in the grand sweep of history at around the 1920s, that another remarkable indigenous writing system burst into existence, the Menda Kikakui script. If the Vice script felt like a story born from a potent individual vision, the Kikakui feels like a slightly more grounded, though still profoundly inspired collective effort, focused intently on the practical need for communication within a community. Imagine you are sitting in a village clearing, the sun beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. You see a group of men, gathered, perhaps around a low table or simply on mats on the ground, their heads bent in concentration. This is the scene you might have witnessed in the early days of the Kikakui script's creation. The central figure in this story is a man named Kisimi Kamara. He wasn't a king or a chief, but he was a learned individual, familiar with the presence and utility of written communication, possibly through exposure to Arabic or English, which were increasingly used in the region. Kamara, like Bukele before him, recognized a pressing need. The Mende language was vibrant, rich in oral tradition, but lacked a widespread, easy-to-use writing system for internal communication among its speakers. Arabic was used by some for religious texts, and English was the language of the colonial administration and coastal trade. But neither was practical for everyday use across the majority of the Mende-speaking population. Kamara, along with a small group of collaborators, accounts mention names like Alhaji Musa Watara and others, set out to invent a script specifically tailored for their language. The story of its creation often includes elements that echo the Vai narrative, suggesting a pattern in how such innovations are sometimes recalled and recounted. It is said that Kamara himself received the initial inspiration in a dream or vision, similar to Bukele. This vision supposedly revealed the basic structure, or perhaps even some of the initial characters of the script. However, the development phase is consistently described as a collaborative, iterative process. Kamara and his colleagues would gather, experiment with symbols, and refine the system through trial and error, testing its ability to represent the sounds of the Mende language accurately and efficiently. Think about being in that room, or clearing. It's not just one guy having a lightning bolt of genius. It's a brainstorming session, ancient style. Okay, how do we write car? Someone might ask. What about this shape? Another suggests, drawing on the ground or a piece of bark. No, that looks too much like kui. Let's try this instead. It's a process of discussion, critique, and refinement. They were literally designing a writing system from the ground up together. This collaborative aspect, building on an initial inspiration, is a key part of the Kikakui origin story, and differentiates it slightly from the more singularly focused narrative around Bukele and Vai. The decision they made, like the Vai creators, was to develop a syllabary. This makes perfect sense for Mende, which also has a relatively straightforward syllable structure, primarily consisting of consonant-vowel syllables. Creating a symbol for each of these common sound units resulted in a system that was much easier to learn and use for native speakers than trying to wrestle with an alphabet or a more complex logographic system. The initial version of the Kikakui syllabary contained around 48 characters, representing the core consonant-vowel combinations. Over time, as its creators and users refined it, the script expanded to represent more sounds and complexities in the language, eventually growing to over 150 characters. Learning this system would have been a grassroots affair. There were no schools teaching Kikakui initially. Knowledge spread from the creators to their immediate circles and then outward through personal instruction. Imagine learning it by watching Kisimi Kamara himself draw the symbols, mimicking his strokes, sounding out the syllables. You might practice by scratching the characters into the dirt with a stick, tracing them onto smooth stones, or carefully drawing them with a piece of charcoal on a piece of bark. This wasn't formal education, it was apprenticeship, a passing down of a powerful new tool within the community. It was like the ultimate DIY language learning kit. The early materials used for writing in Kikakui were similar to those used with Vai, locally available resources. You'd use the juice of certain berries, charcoal mixed with water or plant sap as ink. The surfaces were often leaves, sections of bamboo or smooth pieces of wood. Later, as the script gained traction and access to external goods increased, paper and European pens or pencils became more common. This transition to more conventional writing materials likely helped the script's spread and durability somewhat, allowing for longer-lasting documents. The content written in early kikakui reflects the practical needs and interests of the people who used it. You'd find personal letters, records of debts or transactions, notes about events, historical accounts, and even translations of Islamic prayers or texts. It was a tool for the community for managing affairs, preserving knowledge, and communicating across distances. The existence of these documents, though many have been lost to time and tropical conditions, is a mainstream historical fact that demonstrates the vibrant use of the script in the early 20th century. It wasn't just an intellectual exercise, it was a functional script. The quirky or fringe tidbit connected to kikakui often revolves around the mystical element sometimes attributed to its origin. While the collaborative development is well documented, the initial spark, that dream or vision attributed to Kamara, remains somewhat enigmatic. Was it a genuinely supernatural event? Was it a symbolic way of explaining a moment of profound creative insight? Or was it perhaps influenced by the similar origin story of the Vai script, which was known in neighbouring regions, becoming part of a narrative template for indigenous script creation? The degree to which spirits or dreams were literally involved versus being metaphorical language for inspiration is one of those fascinating areas where oral tradition and historical documentation intersect, leaving room for different interpretations. It makes for a much better story than Kamara had a really good think and came up with it, right? The Mende Kikakui script spread within the Mende speaking areas, primarily through its utility and the dedicated efforts of its early proponents. It offered a means of literacy accessible to people who might not have had the opportunity to learn Arabic or English. Literacy in Kikakui became a marker of knowledge and connection within the community. Imagine the pride and empowerment that came with being able to read and write in your own language, using a script created by your own people. It was a powerful statement of cultural identity and self-reliance. However, like many indigenous scripts across Africa, Kikakui faced immense pressure over the 20th century. This is where the open scholarly debate phrase comes in. Historians and linguists still debate the primary factors that led to the decline in widespread use of scripts like Kikakui and Vai. Was it the overwhelming economic and political dominance of colonial languages like English and French? Was it the association of indigenous scripts with traditional or uneducated populations by colonial authorities or Western-educated elites? Was it the practical difficulties of producing printed materials, or teaching the script on a large scale without institutional support? Or was it a combination of all these factors, perhaps exacerbated by internal conflicts or changes in societal structure? Pinpointing the exact cause or the most significant cause of the shift away from using these unique scripts in everyday life is complex and still discussed among researchers. It's not as simple as saying colonialism killed it, although that was certainly a major factor. The challenges were significant. As formal education systems teaching English were established, and Arabic literacy continued for religious purposes, learning Kikakui often became a secondary concern or something learned informally outside of school. The lack of standardized fonts or easy printing methods, compared to Latin or Arabic scripts, also limited its ability to compete in the era of mass media and official documentation. Furthermore, the periods of instability and civil conflict that Sierra Leone has experienced in its history disrupted communities and traditional forms of knowledge transmission, further impacting the use of the script. Despite these pressures, the Mende Kikakui script, like Vai, has not completely vanished. It is still known and cherished by some elders and cultural enthusiasts among the Mende people. There have been efforts in recent years to revive its use, teach it to younger generations, and integrate it into digital platforms. These revitalization movements are driven by a deep respect for the ingenuity of the script's creators and a desire to preserve this unique part of Mende cultural heritage. It's a quiet resurgence, a flicker of the flame kept alive against the winds of globalization and linguistic assimilation. As you drift deeper into the rhythm of the night, picture Kizmi Kamara and his colleagues, their hands stained with ink from berries and charcoal, painstakingly drawing symbols, testing them out, discussing, refining. Imagine the sounds of their voices as they identified the syllables of the Mende language, giving each one a unique visual form. think about the messages carried by those early Kikakui texts. Practical notes, heartfelt letters, stories from the past. They are echoes of a time when creativity and necessity converged to produce a powerful tool for communication, leaving a legacy that, while challenged, refuses to be entirely forgotten. You've moved west again, Obi, past the coast where the forests thicken and the humidity hangs heavy, crossing borders that were drawn much later than the ancient pathways you're traversing, leaving the coastal Mendi lands behind. Now you find yourself further inland, in what is modern-day Guinea. The sounds might be different here, the languages shifting slightly, the air carrying the scent of different crops, perhaps shea or ground nuts drying in the sun. You are entering a part of West Africa where the Mand languages are spoken in many variations, stretching across multiple countries, and it is here, in the middle of the 20th century, that another explosion of indigenous literacy occurred, perhaps the most ambitious and arguably the most successful in terms of modern adaptation, the Neko script. If I was born from a dream and Kikakui from collaborative necessity, Neko feels like it sprang fully formed from a mind determined to prove a point and uplift a people. The central figure here is Solomon Kante, a teacher and scholar born in Kankan, Guinea in 22. Kante was literate in Arabic and French, the prevalent languages of administration and religion at the time, but he became deeply frustrated by the prevailing narrative, sometimes perpetuated by colonial powers, and even some educated Africans influenced by them, that African languages were primitive or incapable of expressing complex ideas in written form, and certainly couldn't have their own writing systems. He heard the stories, perhaps felt the sting of the casual dismissal of his rich cultural and linguistic heritage. The commonly cited story of Neko's creation, a mainstream historical fact, is that Kante was spurred to action by reading an article written by a European journalist who asserted that Africans were savages because their languages lacked indigenous scripts. This insult, this deeply inaccurate and prejudiced statement, ignited a fire within Kante. He wasn't just offended, he was motivated. He saw the wealth and complexity of the Manda languages, a family of related languages spoken by millions across a vast swathe of West Africa, including Mandinka, Bambara, Diula, and many others. And he knew they deserved their own written voice. He decided right then and there that he would create one. Talk about turning negative feedback into rocket fuel, right? Imagine if every online troll sparked a revolutionary cultural movement. The world would be a very different place. Kante embarked on an intense, dedicated study. He analysed the phonology of the Mande languages, the distinct sounds they use, how those sounds combine, the tones, the nasalizations. He spent years meticulously cataloguing sounds, experimenting with symbols, and developing a system that could accurately represent the spoken word. Unlike the Vai and Kikakui syllabaries, which primarily represented consonant-vowel units, Kante opted for a system that was closer to an alphabet or, more accurately, an abjad with vowels. Neko uses separate letters for consonants and vowels, but the vowels are often written as diacritics above or below the consonant letter, making it a sort of hybrid system optimized for the structure of Mande syllables. It also includes specific characters for tones, which are crucial for meaning in many Mande languages. The resulting script is elegant and logical, is written from right to left like Arabic, which some suggest might have been a conscious choice to ease the transition for people already literate Arabic, or perhaps simply reflected an aesthetic preference. Historians still argue whether the right-to-left direction and certain visual characteristics of Neko characters show a direct influence from Arabic script, or if these are independent developments driven by functionality and design principles. Kante himself stated his primary goal was phonetic accuracy and ease of learning for Mand speakers, regardless of influence. Kante officially presented the Neko script to the world in 1949. The name Neko itself is derived from the Manda word meaning I say, emphasizing the script's purpose as a tool for expression and communication. His vision was pan-Mande. He didn't want to create a script just for his specific dialect, but one that could potentially be used, with minor adaptations, to write all the Mand languages. This was an incredibly ambitious goal, akin to creating a single script for all the Romance languages in Europe or all the Slavic languages. It required a deep understanding of the shared linguistic roots and the variations across the family. The spread of Nko in its early days was a remarkable grassroots phenomenon, relying entirely on Conte's dedication and the enthusiasm of early adopters. Conte didn't have access to fancy printing presses or government funding. He taught the script himself, gathered students in informal settings, and wrote materials by hand. Imagine sitting with him, perhaps under a tree or in a simple room, watching as he carefully drew these new symbols on a slate or a piece of paper, explaining how they corresponded to the sounds you spoke every day. You'd practice writing them yourself, probably with charcoal, ink made from natural dyes, or even just a finger tracing in the sand. The materials used for writing in the early Nko communities were whatever was available. Handwritten manuscripts were painstakingly produced using ink made from lamp black, soot, mixed with a binder, or perhaps plant-based dyes, applied with a reed pen or a sharpened stick. Paper, when available, was prized, but bark, leaves, or even smoothed animal skins might have been used in some contexts, though surviving examples on such perishable materials are rare. The act of writing itself was often slow and deliberate, a skilled craft. This focus on basic, readily available materials speaks to the urgency and passion behind the movement. They weren't waiting for external resources, they were using what they had to create literacy. Now. That's the kind of resourcefulness that makes you appreciate your fancy ballpoint pen and lined notebook, isn't it? We take instant ink flow for granted. The content produced in early Nko was incredibly diverse, reflecting the desire to bring all aspects of knowledge and life into the written Manda world. You'd find practical texts, correspondence, commercial records, legal documents. You'd find religious texts, translations of the Quran and Islamic literature. You'd find educational materials, primers for learning the script, texts on history, geography, science and mathematics, often written or translated by Conte and his students. There was a conscious effort to create a modern literature and body of knowledge in Nko, demonstrating that Manda languages were perfectly capable of handling contemporary subjects. A quirky or fringe tidbit about Nko is the almost evangelical zeal with which it was spread by Conte and his early disciples. They didn't just teach the script, they saw it as a tool of liberation, a way to empower African people by giving them direct access to knowledge in their own languages, bypassing colonial gatekeepers. Conte established Nko schools, or learning circles across Guinea and into neighbouring countries like Mali and Côte d'Ivoire. These were informal networks, often meeting in homes or community centres. Learning Nko wasn't just about literacy. It was an act of cultural assertion and political self-determination, even if not explicitly anti-colonial in every instance. It was about taking control of the narrative, quite literally. Despite its innovative design and the passion of its proponents, Nko faced significant challenges, many mirroring those faced by Vai and Kikakui. The overwhelming dominance of French, the colonial language in Guinea, Mali and Côte d'Ivoire, and Arabic for religious education, informal education and official life was a constant hurdle. Governments often did not recognise Nko, making it difficult to use in official documents or integrate into state-run schools. The lack of standardised printing facilities initially also made mass production of Nko materials difficult compared to scripts using the Latin alphabet. This struggle for recognition and resources is a recurring theme for many indigenous scripts. However, Nko possessed certain advantages that allowed it to persist and even thrive in the digital age. Conte's logical and comprehensive design, accurately representing Manda phonology, made it adaptable. Its pan-Manda vision, while challenging to fully realise due to dialectical differences, fostered a sense of shared identity among speakers of various Manda languages. And crucially, Nko communities have been remarkably adept at embracing modern technology. In recent decades, there has been a significant effort to digitize Nko, create fonts, develop keyboards, and use it online. You can now find Nko used in social media, email, and websites, a feat that has given it a new lease on life far beyond what Kante might have imagined in 1949. This adaptation to the digital world is a key mainstream historical fact about Nko's trajectory, setting it apart from some other scripts. The vibrant use of Nko online and in community settings today stands in contrast to the decline faced by some other scripts, but it still faces challenges. Historians still argue whether Nko has genuinely achieved its pan-Manda potential, given the continued prominence of national borders and specific Manda language identities. While many Manda speakers can read Nko, literacy rates vary and the sheer diversity of the language family presents ongoing challenges for full standardization and universal comprehension. The debate continues. Is Nko a widely successful pan-Manda script, or a very successful script used primarily by specific Manda communities. It's a nuanced question about identity, language, and the realities of cross-border communication. As you settle further into the quiet hum of the night, imagine Solomon Akante, driven by a powerful sense of purpose, meticulously charting the sounds of his language, crafting a system of symbols designed to unlock knowledge for millions. Picture the early learners, huddled together, their faces illuminated by lamplight, tracing unfamiliar characters that represented the very words they spoke. Think about the ambition, the sheer willpower required to create a whole new way of writing, not just for a village or a region, but for an entire language family, stretching across nations. Nko is a testament to the power of individual vision combined with community effort. A script born from necessity and nurtured by a fierce desire for self-expression and intellectual independence, a voice saying, "I say," that continues to echo today. You've travelled east with the whispers of Nko sensing its modern pulse, but now you drift back west, coastward, towards the humid air and the verdant tangle of forest that define parts of Sierra Leone and neighbouring Liberia. The landscape shifts again. Perhaps the air feels thicker, carrying the scent of damp earth and unseen blossoms. You hear different bird calls. The rhythm of the spoken languages changes, subtly but distinctly, as you move from one community's traditional lands to another. This is a region where innovation wasn't confined to just one or two flashes of brilliance like Vai or Kikakui. Across this vibrant, linguistically diverse area, the urge to capture language in written form seemed to ripple through various communities in the early to mid-20th century. While Vai holds the historical spotlight for this specific coastal region, and Kikakui emerged from the Mendi heartland, they weren't the only players in the game of creating indigenous scripts. Think of it like a historical tech startup scene. But instead of Silicon Valley venture capitalists, you have visionary individuals, sometimes chiefs, sometimes teachers, sometimes just regular folks with a burning idea fueled by a desire for their language to be seen, read, and preserved. These were often localized efforts, born from specific community needs or the singular drive of an inventor. And while many didn't achieve the pan-regional reach of Nko or the historical depth of Vai, their existence speaks volumes about the intellectual dynamism of the time and place. Let's settle in for a moment with the Kayal script. The Kapele people live across Liberia and into Guinea, and they speak a Manda language, related distantly to the languages Nko was designed for, but distinct enough to warrant a different approach if you were starting from scratch. And that's exactly what happened in the 30s. A Liberian man named Ghibli, also known as Chief Ghibli, is credited with inventing the Kapela syllabary. This script, like Vai and Kikakui, was a syllabary, meaning each character generally represented a syllable, typically a consonant followed by a vowel. This makes sense for languages where most words are built from simple consonant-vowel structures. Trying to make an alphabet for a language where every word is Kapulati is just more work than it needs to be, right? Syllabaries are often more intuitive for such languages. Djibili's story is less documented than Momolu Duwalu Bukele's or Solomon Akante's, shrouded a bit more in local lore and scattered accounts. The commonly cited mainstream historical fact is that the Kapela script was developed around 1935. Unlike the perhaps years-long refinement process of some other scripts, some accounts suggest Ghibli developed his syllabary relatively quickly. A quirky or fringe tidbit often associated with the Kapela script is the idea that Ghibli received divine inspiration or had a particularly intense period of focused creation, perhaps similar to the dream narrative of Vai, although details are scarce and vary depending on the source. Whether it was a lightning bolt of genius or just really hard work, he produced a unique system of characters that represented the sounds of the Kapela language. The Kapela syllabary consisted of around 88 characters. Each character had a base shape, and sometimes a dot or other small mark was added to differentiate syllables that sounded very similar but had different tones or nasalization, those crucial phonetic nuances that language nerds get excited about. The script was typically written from left to right, which was perhaps influenced by exposure to the Latin alphabet used by missionaries and the Liberian government, or perhaps just a practical choice for the inventor. It was functional and specific to Kapel phonology. However, the Kapel script didn't spread far beyond a relatively small group of speakers, mostly in Liberia. Several factors contributed to its limited impact. Firstly, it emerged during a period when English, the official language of Liberia, was becoming increasingly dominant in education and administration. Secondly, unlike Co., which had a proponent dedicated to widespread teaching and material creation, or Vai, which initially had powerful patrons, the Capelle script lacked that centralized, sustained effort for dissemination. Literacy in Capelle using Gibili's script remained largely confined to small, dedicated circles. Imagine trying to launch a new social media app without any marketing budget, celebrity endorsements, or even reliable internet access. That was the challenge many of these localized scripts faced. Another interesting, though less successful script emerged among the Loma people, who also live in Liberia and Guinea. The Loma script, or Toma script, was reportedly invented by a chief named Widow Zobo around 1930. Like Capelle, it was a syllabary designed to capture the sounds of the Loma language. It had somewhere in the range of 175 to 185 characters, a larger set than Capelle or Vai, suggesting perhaps a more granular breakdown of syllable types or incorporating tone markings directly into the characters. The purpose of the Loma script, according to some accounts, was primarily for record-keeping and correspondence within the chiefdom. It wasn't initially conceived as a tool for mass literacy or broad education in the way Co. was. Think of it more like a personal or community-specific code than a public writing system. Materials for writing would have been basic, perhaps palm leaves, bark, or locally made paper if available, using ink from plants or soot. The scarcity and perishability of these early writing surfaces likely contributed to the limited physical evidence of widespread use today. Trying to preserve ancient emails sent via coconut shell is surprisingly difficult, turns out. The Loma script also faced the uphill battle against English and French literacy promoted by colonial and national governments, as well as the influence of Arabic literacy in some areas. It never gained significant traction outside of a few communities in Toyin, and its use declined significantly over the 20th century. There are still a few individuals who remember and can read the script, holding on to this unique piece of their heritage, but it is considered endangered. Comparing these scripts, Capelle and Loma, to Vai and Co, highlights the complex interplay of factors required for a writing system to thrive. Vai benefited from being the first, gaining some initial recognition and patronage and fostering a strong sense of community identity around it. Co benefited from its pan-Manda vision, its robust phonetic design, and crucially its founder's tireless advocacy and the later embrace of digital technologies. Capelle and Loma, despite being innovative in their own right, lacked some of these critical elements. They were often localized, their creators lacked the resources or widespread platform of a Solomon Akante, and they faced the relentless pressure of dominant global languages without significant institutional support. Historians still argue whether there was any direct influence or cross-pollination between these various coastal scripts. Did Gibili see some examples of Vai characters? Did Widow Zobo know about the Capelle script? Or were these entirely independent inventions, arising from similar needs and linguistic structures? The evidence is fragmented. Some scholars point to minor visual similarities in certain characters across different scripts as potential signs of influence, while others argue that these could simply be coincidental outcomes of similar design challenges when creating syllabic characters. It's a fascinating puzzle. Were they all working from the same basic blueprint in the air, or were they truly reinventing the wheel in parallel workshops? The existence of Capelle, Loma, and likely other undocumented or long-vanished scripts in this region underscores a crucial point. The development of writing systems in West Africa wasn't an isolated phenomenon. It was a bubbling cauldron of creativity and intellectual energy. The motivation to create these scripts came from within the communities themselves. A desire to communicate, record history, manage affairs, and express identity in their own linguistic voice. Even if a script only served a small group for a generation, it represents a powerful act of cultural agency in the face of external pressures. It's a reminder that human ingenuity is a global commodity, not limited by geography or access to formal education systems. These forgotten characters, etched onto whatever surface was available, are testaments to that enduring drive. As you picture the dense forests and winding rivers of this coastal region, imagine the quiet, focused work of people like Gibili and Widow Zobo, meticulously drawing their characters, perhaps teaching a few students by flickering lamplight. They weren't famous inventors in the global sense, but within their communities, they were pioneers, offering a new way to see and share language. The fact that these scripts existed at all, alongside the more prominent ones, reveals a hidden layer of linguistic and cultural history, a secret library written in unique symbols, waiting for us to appreciate the effort it took to create even a single page. You've drifted from the humid coastal forests, leaving the whispers of Capelle and Loma characters behind you, their unique shapes fading like mist in the morning sun. The focus shifts now, moving inland back towards the great river arteries like the Niger, routes that weren't just paths for water, but highways for goods, people, and ideas stretching across the vast savannah and connecting distant worlds. You find yourself standing not in a quiet village where a single chief keeps records, but in a bustling marketplace, perhaps Timbuktu or Jenne in their prime, the air thick with the scent of spices, leather, and the murmur of countless voices bartering and trading. In this setting, the purpose of writing takes on a different hue. It's not just about preserving sacred texts or personal histories or creating a script for cultural pride, though those uses certainly existed and thrived. Here, writing was utterly practical, the invisible glue holding together complex networks of commerce and administration. Imagine the sheer volume of transactions happening daily. Caravans arriving with salt from the Sahara, departing with gold and enslaved people for the north, local farmers bringing grain and cloth, artisans selling their wares. Without a way to record who owes what, who bought how much, and who is responsible for which shipment, the whole system would collapse into chaotic shouting matches and forgotten promises. This is where writing systems, primarily Arabic in the major trading centres for centuries due to the influence of trans-Saharan trade and Islam, but potentially indigenous scripts too, came into their own as tools of business and governance. You needed to write contracts, track inventory, calculate taxes, document debts, and issue permits. It was the ancient world's version of spreadsheets and ledger books, probably a lot less frustrating than modern Excel, but possibly equally prone to typos if your hand slipped while drawing a character. Think about the ink itself in this context. For everyday use, clarity and durability were paramount. You weren't necessarily trying to create illuminated manuscripts, but documents that could survive the dust of the marketplace, the bumpiness of a camel's journey, and the passage of time in a chest. The soot-based inks we discussed earlier, lamp black mixed with a binder like gum arabic or honey, would have been excellent for this. They were relatively easy to make from readily available materials. Just light a lamp or a smoky fire, collect the soot, mix it. The carbon particles in soot make for an incredibly stable pigment that doesn't fade over time, unlike many plant-based dyes. Imagine pulling out a document written centuries ago with carbon ink and the writing is still crisp and black, looking like it was written yesterday, assuming the paper or parchment hasn't disintegrated. It's the original permanent marker, basically. For administrative purposes, such as official decrees, property records, or legal judgments, you might find more durable writing surfaces too, while paper became increasingly available through trade, especially from North Africa. Parchment or the treated animal skins were also used, as were wooden boards for temporary notes or practice. The choice of surface and ink wasn't just about availability, it could also signify the importance and intended lifespan of the document. A casual note about a small debt might be scratched onto a piece of bark with charcoal, while a major trade agreement or a royal decree would be carefully inscribed on durable paper or parchment with rich black carbon ink. The mainstream historical fact here is that major West African empires like the Mali and Songhai empires relied heavily on written records, primarily in Arabic, for their administration, tax collection, and legal systems. Scribes were essential figures, often associated with centres of learning and commerce like Timbuktu. These weren't just libraries full of religious texts, they were also repositories of legal documents, state correspondence, and detailed accounts of trade. You'd have officials meticulously recording how much salt came in, how much gold went out, who paid their taxes and who didn't, and mediating disputes based on written law. This wasn't just oral tradition anymore. It was bureaucracy, ancient style, and powered by ink. Imagine being a merchant in 14th century Timbuktu. You've just received a caravan full of goods. You need to document the contents, calculate their value, figure out the taxes owed to the emperor, and record who is buying what on credit. You'd likely employ or work with a scribe, fluent in Arabic, the lingua franca of the merchant class across the Sahara, carefully dipping a reed pen into a pot of dark ink, drawing elegant script onto a sheet of paper. Every stroke represented a unit of wealth, a link in a vast economic chain. These records weren't just abstract numbers. They represented tangible goods, human labour, and the prosperity of entire cities. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit, while Arabic was dominant for state and international commerce, There's evidence suggesting indigenous systems of notation or record-keeping might have persisted alongside it, especially at local levels or for specific types of trade. For example, some communities had complex systems for tracking cowrie shells, a common form of currency, or units of gold dust that might have involved tally marks, specific symbols, or even knotted cords like the Andean quipu, though the mechanisms would have been different, in combination with or instead of script. Imagine a system where specific knots or arrangements on a string represented quantities or types of goods, and these were used to verify transactions or inventory alongside written notes. It adds another layer to the picture, a blend of different information technologies coexisting. Perhaps you'd hand over a meticulously written invoice and a coded string of cowrie shells to confirm a delivery. Here's the bill, and yes, the cowries match. It's all correct. Historians still argue whether these indigenous notation systems were independent inventions or influenced by contact with written scripts like Arabic. Were they fully functional systems capable of recording complex information, or primarily mnemonic devices used to aid memory alongside oral agreements? The lack of preserved physical evidence makes definitive conclusions difficult, leaving room for fascinating scholarly debate. It's like trying to piece together the history of early spreadsheets when all you have are a few crumpled printouts. Something was happening, but the full picture is hazy. The practicality extended beyond just trade. Administration of large territories required written communication. Messengers carried scrolls or folded papers containing orders from this emperor to provincial governors, reports from those governors back to the capital, census information or the ancient equivalent, and records of judicial proceedings. Imagine the precarious journey of a lone messenger, perhaps on camel or horseback, carrying a document vital to the governance of a kingdom. The dark ink on the page representing the very word of the ruler. The ink itself had to be relatively fast-drying to prevent smudging, especially if documents were rolled or folded for transport. The soot-based inks dried primarily by evaporation, leaving the solid carbon particles fixed to the surface by the binder. This contrasts with some European iron gall inks, which relied on a chemical reaction that could sometimes eat through the paper over centuries. The stability of carbon ink was a major advantage for longevity, perhaps contributing to the survival of some of the manuscripts that exist today. It's a testament to the effectiveness of simple natural chemistry. The preparation of large quantities of ink would have been a small industry in itself. Someone had to be responsible for collecting soot, grinding it to a fine powder and carefully mixing it with the binder to the right consistency, not too thick to clog the pen, not too thin to bleed on the writing surface. The quality of the ink could vary, affecting the clarity and legibility of the writing. A good scribe needed good ink, and a good ink maker was likely a valued person in the community. Beyond basic record-keeping, ink and script were used in legal contexts. Laws were written down, judgments recorded. Imagine a village elder or a judge referencing a written document to settle a dispute, the weight of the written word adding authority to the decision. This wasn't just about remembering past rulings, it was about establishing a consistent legal framework, written in permanent ink. We also see the intertwining of practical and spiritual uses. Amulets like the Islamic kitab worn for protection were written on small pieces of paper or parchment and sewn into leather pouches. The act of writing specific verses or prayers in ink was believed to imbue the object with power, so the same ink used to record a shipment of gold could also be used to write a protective charm. The line between the sacred and the mundane was often blurred, with ink serving both purposes. Even in areas where a formal writing system wasn't widespread for complex tasks, simple marks, symbols, or glyphs were used for practical purposes like marking property, identifying goods, or indicating ownership. These might not constitute a full script, but they were forms of visual communication using pigments or incisions, precursors to or companions of formal writing systems. Think of cattle brands or symbols carved into tools, early forms of inked identification. The invisible ink of commerce wasn't literally invisible, of course, but it was the unsung hero of the trade networks and administrative systems. While the libraries of Timbuktu are celebrated for their scholarly and religious texts, it's crucial to remember that a vast amount of writing produced in these centres, and across West Africa where writing systems took root, was purely functional. It was the ink on ledgers, contracts, letters, and tax records that kept the wheels of society turning. This practical application demonstrates the deep integration of literacy into the economic and political fabric of these regions, showcasing that writing was not just a luxury for the elite or the devout, but a necessary tool for managing complex societies. As you picture the caravans disappearing over the horizon, and the administrators bent over their papers, the quiet scratching of the pen, the faint smell of soot ink, you appreciate the invisible labour that underpinned these historical achievements. It wasn't just grand architecture or military might. It was also the meticulous recording of details, preserved by a humble ink on fragile surfaces, that allowed these civilizations to flourish. You're leaving the administrative hubs now, the scent of trade ledgers and official decrees fading behind you like the dust kicked up by departing caravans. The air grows softer, perhaps a little more humid again, as you move away from the arid savanna centres and towards regions where different needs and different dreams spurred the creation of writing. This isn't the realm of imperial bureaucracy anymore. This is often the realm of individual initiative, cultural pride, and the desire to capture sounds and thoughts in ways that the existing scripts, like Arabic or later European ones, just couldn't do justice to for specific local languages. Imagine yourself sitting in a quiet village, perhaps under the shade of a large tree far from the clamour of Timbuktu. The sounds around you are different. The calls of birds, the rustle of leaves, the murmur of conversation in a language that has flowed through generations but maybe never had a script to call its own. It feels more intimate, more personal. This is where some truly unique writing systems began to emerge, often in the relatively recent past compared to the ancient empires, sometimes born from visions, sometimes from deliberate linguistic work. Let's focus on one fascinating example that pops up in southwestern West Africa, the Vai script. Picture the scene around the 1830s. Oral tradition, and later written accounts, tell a story of 8 men among the Vai people, primarily in what is now Liberia and Sierra Leone. One key figure is reported to be Mamolu Duwalu Bukele. The story goes that this system of writing came to him in a dream. He saw characters, and he saw people reading and writing them. Waking up, he worked with others to turn that dream into a reality, creating a functional script for the Vai language. How cool is that? Getting your writing system delivered via nighttime download? Beats sitting in a classroom, that's for sure, though I imagine the debugging process might have been a bit tricky. This dream character for Bar seems to make my pen bleed. Maybe I dreamt it backwards. The Vai script is what's called a syllabary. Now don't nod off yet. Syllabary just means each character doesn't represent a single letter, like B or A, but a whole syllable, like Ba, Bi, Bo, Bu. English is an alphabet. Korean Hangul is somewhat syllabic in its blocks, but the individual components are letters. Japanese kana, hiragana, and katakana are classic syllabaries, much like Vai. So instead of having characters for around 26 letters or so, like in English, a Vai writer needs to know characters for hundreds of syllables, one for every possible combination of consonant and vowel, and sometimes tone, in the Vai language. Sounds like a lot, right? But it actually makes sense for languages where syllables are very distinct and important units of sound. It means words can often be shorter in terms of the number of characters needed compared to an alphabet. Think about the mental shift required. You're not sounding out B plus A is Bay. You see one symbol, and that symbol is Ba. It's like seeing the at symbol and just knowing it means at without thinking of the letters. Imagine trying to write a sentence in Vai, carefully selecting each character representing a full spoken beat of the language. It's a different rhythm of writing, isn't it? A different way of mapping sound to sight. Now, what about the ink and the materials used for writing this dream-inspired script? Initially, and for much of its history, the Vai script was likely written using locally available resources. We're back to the basics we touched on earlier. Carbon ink made from soot would have been the most common. You'd find a smoky cooking fire, collect the soot from the bottom of a pot or the inside of a chimney, if they had chimneys in the way we think of them, probably more like smoke vents, mix it with water and a binder like gum arabic, harvested from acacia trees, common across parts of Africa, or perhaps a sugary solution from fruits or honey. This made a stable black ink. The writing surfaces would also be local. While paper became more available over time through trade, early Vai writings were often on leaves, tree bark, or smoothed wooden boards for temporary notes or learning. Imagine scratching the syllabic characters onto a piece of bark with a sharpened stick or a reed pen, dipped in homemade ink. The texture of the bark, the slightly uneven flow of the ink, the earthy smell, it's a much more organic, grounded writing experience than typing on a plastic keyboard. No spell check, just your memory of the characters and the shape your hand makes. The development of the Vai script is a mainstream historical fact. It's a well-documented case of an indigenous writing system emerging in the 19th century. Its existence challenged the prevailing European view that West African cultures were purely oral and incapable of creating their own complex scripts. Here was proof, clear as day or clear as soot ink on bark, that intellectual innovation was thriving independently. It's like finding out your grandpa secretly built a rocket in his shed. Totally changes your perspective. For a quirky tidbit, consider this. The Vi script is one of only a handful of known cases globally where a writing system is credibly reported to have been inspired, at least in part, by a dream. While many cultures have myths about writing being a divine gift, the Vi account is tied to a specific person and time period, giving it a unique place in the history of literacy. Imagine trying to explain that to your friends. Yeah, I got this new font, downloaded it from my subconscious last night. They'd look at you funny. Historians and linguists still argue whether the Vi script was entirely an independent invention, or if the idea was sparked by exposure to other writing systems, like Arabic or even Latin script, which were present in the region due to trade and missionary activity. While the characters themselves are unique to Vi and designed specifically for the language's sounds, the concept of writing might have been inspired by seeing others use scripts. It's the classic debate, spontaneous genius or creative adaptation. The exact degree of external influence remains an open scholarly debate. Think about the ink again. If you were a Vi scribe, you wouldn't be ordering a fancy bottle of Noodler's ink online. You'd be responsible for making it yourself or getting it from someone in the community who knew how. This wasn't a factory product. It was a craft. The consistency might vary, the shade of black might differ slightly from batch to batch, depending on the soot source or binder used. It adds another layer of human touch to every document produced. Every character wasn't just a symbol, it carried the faint aroma of the fire it came from. The Vi script was used for various purposes beyond just initial literacy. It was used for correspondence between individuals, for keeping records, personal histories, debts, events, and even for writing down traditional stories and proverbs, preserving them in a form directly tied to the Vi language structure, not filtered through the sounds and structures of Arabic or English. This felt like their writing, for their thoughts in their words. Fast forward a bit and we see another powerful example. The Neko script, created by Solomana Kante in Kankan, Guinea in the late 1940s. Kante was motivated by a desire to create a writing system that could accurately represent the sounds of the Manding languages, a group including Mandinka, Bambara and Jula, which he felt were misrepresented or poorly served by the Arabic and Latin scripts used in the region. He also had a strong Pan-African vision, seeing a common script as a way to unite Manding speakers across different countries and foster literacy and intellectual development. Neko is an alphabet, but it's written from right to left, like Arabic. It has distinct characters for consonants and vowels, and importantly, it includes characters for tones, which are crucial for meaning in many West African languages, including Manding. This was a deliberate intellectual creation, born out of linguistic analysis and cultural pride, contrasting a bit with the dreamlike origin story of Vi. Kante studied other scripts, understood their limitations for Manding, and engineered something new and effective. It's like comparing a traditional architect inspired by nature to a modern engineer designing a bridge. Both impressive, just different processes. The ink for Neko initially would have followed similar traditions, local, homemade. Solomana Kante and his early students and collaborators would have used whatever was available and effective. Carbon black was the reliable choice, offering permanence and good contrast on surfaces. As Neko gained traction and printing became possible, commercially produced inks would eventually be used, but its roots are firmly in the tradition of the homemade brew. The spread of Neko is itself a story of dedication. Kante and his followers actively taught the script, established schools and produced literature, newspapers, and even scientific texts in Neko. It wasn't just about writing letters, it was about building a body of modern knowledge in a West African language using an indigenous script. This was a powerful statement of intellectual self-reliance. Imagine starting a newspaper where every single article had to be written, edited and printed using a brand new script you helped invent. That takes serious commitment, probably fueled by copious amounts of strong locally brewed tea or whatever the stimulant of choice was. A quirky detail about Neko is its inclusion of characters specifically for tones. Tones can completely change the meaning of a word in Manding languages. For example, the same sequence of consonant and vowel sounds might mean dog, house, or river, depending on the pitch contour of the vowels. Including tone markers in the script was a linguistic innovation that made Neko far more precise for these languages than scripts that ignore tone. It's like having punctuation marks that change the meaning of a sentence, not just how you read it. Let's eat, Grandma, versus let's eat, Grandma. Tone matters. Historians still debate the extent to which Nko has achieved its Pan-African goals and the challenges it faces in coexisting with dominant colonial languages, French and English, and the widespread use of Arabic script for religious purposes. While Nko has a dedicated following and continues to be used and promoted, its path to widespread adoption is complex and faces numerous socio-political hurdles. Will it become a major script uniting millions, or remain a vital but niche tool for cultural and intellectual expression? The outcome is still being written, sometimes literally, in Ninko ink. The creation of scripts like Vi and Nko and others you might encounter in different regions represents a powerful assertion of identity and intellectual agency. These weren't just about adopting a tool from outside, they were about crafting a tool that fit the unique shape of a language and the specific needs of a community or a broader cultural movement. The ink used might have been the same basic recipe as that used in ancient times, a simple mix of soot and binder. But when it formed these new indigenous characters, it carried a different weight, a different meaning. It was the ink of dreams made visible, the ink of deliberate cultural resurgence. It reminds you that writing isn't just about communication, it's often about who gets to communicate in what language, and on whose terms, and sometimes those terms are dictated by a dream or a passionate belief in the power of your own words. You've seen how indigenous scripts like Vi and Nko emerged from cultural need and intellectual drive, and how they relied on locally sourced inks. Now let's really get our hands dirty, or at least imagine we are, and delve into the heart of that ink. Forget the fancy fountain pen inks of today, with their precise chemical compositions and plastic cartridges. We're talking about making ink from scratch, a process that connects you directly to the earth and the elemental forces that create colour and substance. At its core, the black ink used across West Africa for centuries, from the scribes of Timbuktu to the village elders writing in Vi, was remarkably consistent in its fundamental recipe: a pigment source, a binder, and a liquid medium. The pigment was almost universally carbon. Why carbon? Because it's readily available, incredibly stable, and creates a deep, rich black. It's basically the OG black colorant. Think about it. Soot is everywhere you have fire, and fire has been central to human life forever. Carbon particles are tiny, opaque, and they stick around. Unless you physically remove them, they don't fade like many plant-based dyes or react chemically and disappear. They just are. Where did this carbon come from? The most prized source was often lamp black. Imagine a small clay lamp burning oil, palm oil, shea butter oil, whatever was locally available. You'd hold a plate or a piece of pottery or even a large shell just above the flame. The incomplete combustion of the oil releases tiny particles of carbon, which collect as a fluffy, intensely black soot on the surface. It's a slow process, patiently collecting the fine powder, but the reward is a pure, deep black pigment. Think of it as artisanal, small-batch carbon collection. Trying this at home? Maybe not, unless you want to explain the soot stains to your landlord. Besides, modern lamps might not produce the right kind of soot, and setting things on fire indoors is generally discouraged these days. Safety first, history later. Another source was the soot collected from cooking fires. You know the black stuff that accumulates on the inside of chimneys or cooking pots? That's carbon too. It might not be as finely powdered or as pure as lamp black. It could contain ash or other impurities, but it was abundant and easy to get. Grinding this soot down in a mortar and pestle would break up larger clumps and make it usable. Then there's charcoal itself, the burnt wood. Finely ground charcoal can also serve as a pigment, though it tends to be a bit grittier and less intensely black than soot. But when you need ink and that's what you have, you make it work. It's the original use what you've got philosophy. So you have your carbon pigment, this fine black powder. But powder alone doesn't make ink. If you mix carbon powder with just water and tried to write, it would be streaky, wouldn't stick well to the writing surface, and would smudge easily. You need something to bind those carbon particles together and make them adhere to the paper, parchment, wood, or whatever you're writing on. This is where the binder comes in, the unsung hero of the ink world. The most common binder in West Africa was gum arabic. Remember those acacia trees scattered across the savannah and Sahel? They secrete a sticky, resinous sap when their bark is injured. This sap dries into hard, translucent nodules, that's gum arabic. It's water-soluble, acts as a natural adhesive, and crucially, when mixed with pigment and water, It allows the ink to flow smoothly from the pen and dry into a stable, non-smudging line. It's like nature's own glue stick, but for ink. Collecting gum arabic was a significant activity in some regions, and it was a valuable trade commodity itself, known for its use in everything from ink to medicine to food. To prepare the binder, you take the dried gum arabic nodules, perhaps crush them a bit, and dissolve them in warm water. It takes time and careful stirring to get a smooth, lump-free solution. The concentration of the gum solution is important. Too little, and the ink smudges. Too much, and it becomes too thick, sticky, and won't flow well from the pen. It's a delicate balance, a bit like making gravy. You need just the right consistency. Get it wrong, and your important letter to the Sultan might just look like a Rorschach test made of soot. Once your gum arabic solution is ready, you combine it with your carbon powder. This is where the real ink making happens. You'd add the liquid binder gradually to the pigment, grinding and mixing them together on a smooth stone or in a mortar. You're aiming to disperse those tiny carbon particles evenly throughout the liquid, preventing clumps and ensuring a consistent colour. It requires patience, elbow grease, and a good eye for texture and flow. Imagine the rhythmic sound of the pestle grinding, the gradual transformation of black dust into a smooth, viscous liquid. Other binders might have been used depending on the region and available resources. Some plant saps or extracts with adhesive properties could potentially serve the same purpose. Sweet solutions like honey or fruit juices might also work to a degree, providing a sticky residue when dried, though they might not be as stable or long-lasting as gum arabic and could attract insects, which would be a rather annoying issue for your carefully written manuscript. Oh, looks like the termites are enjoying my poetry again. Should have used more gum, less honey. The liquid medium, usually water, was also crucial. The quality of the water could affect the ink. Hard water containing minerals might interact differently with the gum or pigment than soft water. Cleanliness was also important. You didn't want grit or microbes in your ink pot, potentially clogging your pen or affecting the ink's stability over time. Scribes probably preferred clean, clear water, perhaps from a trusted well or spring. Let's pause for a mainstream historical fact. The use of carbon-based ink, specifically made from soot in a gum binder, is one of the oldest and most widespread ink technologies known to humanity. Evidence of carbon ink dating back thousands of years has been found in places as diverse as ancient Egypt, China, and India. Its presence in West Africa is part of this global heritage of simple, effective, and durable writing materials. It's a technology that predates ballpoint pens by, a few millennia. For a quirky tidbit, some traditional ink recipes in various cultures have included ingredients added for purposes other than binding or colouring. While not definitively proven for every West African tradition, globally, things like bile, to make ink flow better, honey for flexibility and shine despite the insect risk, or even mild poisons have been rumoured additives, sometimes practical, sometimes based on superstition. Imagine adding a drop of something questionable just to make your ink extra potent. Probably best we stick to gum arabic, honestly. Less chance of accidentally poisoning your reader. Historians still argue whether certain regions developed unique, highly specific ink recipes that were closely guarded secrets, passed down through families of scribes or specific craft guilds. Was there a secret source that made the ink from Timbuktu particularly good, or was it mostly variations on the standard soot and gum theme based on local ingredient quality and individual skill? The extent of standardization versus purely artisanal variation remains an open scholarly debate. Without written records detailing specific recipes, because, they were often making ink to create the written records, it's hard to know for sure. The process of making ink wasn't just about mixing ingredients. It was a craft requiring skill and knowledge. Too much grinding could make the ink too thick, not enough, and it would be gritty. The ratio of pigment to binder to water was key to getting the right consistency, an ink that flowed smoothly from the pen but didn't spread or bleed on the writing surface. Scribes likely adjusted their recipes slightly depending on the surface they were writing on, a rough piece of bark needing a different viscosity than smooth-treated leather or imported paper. Think about the sensory experience again, the smell of the soot, slightly acrid and smoky, the earthy scent of the dissolved gum arabic, the cool feel of the mixing stone under your hands, the deep blackness that slowly emerges as the ingredients combine. It's a tactile, olfactory, visual process, connecting the act of writing directly to the natural world and the efforts of human hands. It's not just opening a bottle, it's creating the very medium through which thoughts are preserved. Consider the cost too. While soot was essentially free for anyone with a fire, Gum arabic and other potential binders or additives had value. Obtaining high-quality gum arabic involved labour and trade of Morocco. This wasn't free writing, even if the basic components seem simple. The materials themselves were commodities, part of the economic ecosystem of the time. The tools for applying this ink were equally simple and ingenious. Reed pens were common, made by cutting and shaping the end of a reed stalk to create a nib that could hold and release ink. Sharpened sticks or quills from bird feathers could also be used, similar to practices found elsewhere in the world. For writing on materials like bark or wood, a stylus or brush might be more appropriate. The pen had to be dipped into the ink regularly, the liquid seeping into the fibres of the reed or the split of the quill, ready to be released onto the surface. The interaction between the ink, the pen, and the surface was critical. Gritty ink would ruin a fine reed pen nib. An ink that bled too much would make writing on porous bark impossible. An ink that didn't adhere well wouldn't last on leather. Scribes needed to be knowledgeable not just about writing, but about the materials they used, adapting their technique, and perhaps even their ink recipe to the task at hand. It's like a chef understanding how different flours work in different recipes, or a painter knowing how various pigments react on canvas versus wood. In regions where paper became available through trade, often from North Africa or later from Europe, the demands on the ink changed slightly. Paper could be more absorbent than treated leather or some types of bark, requiring an ink that dried quickly but didn't bleed. Scribes likely adapted their binder concentrations or grinding techniques to suit this new material. This wasn't just about adopting a new surface, it was about fine-tuning their ancient technology to work with it. The durability of carbon ink is its superpower. Because the carbon particles are physically embedded in the binder on the surface, they don't fade or react with light or air in the way many dye-based inks do. That's why ancient manuscripts written with carbon ink are still legible today, millennia later. The ink you might have made from soot and gum Arabic centuries ago could potentially still be readable now, provided the writing surface itself survived. It's a testament to the effectiveness of this simple fundamental technology. Think about the contrast with modern inks. We have inks in every colour imaginable, designed for specific printers, pens, surfaces and purposes. They involve complex chemical processes and synthetic ingredients. The ink of historical West Africa, while potentially having regional variations, relied on a core principle. Take something black from nature, carbon, use something sticky from nature, sort of gum, add nature's solvent, water, and mix. It's a direct, elemental approach to capturing thought. The ink pot itself was another small piece of this puzzle. Simple containers, often made of pottery or sometimes metal, held the precious liquid. They needed to be stable, not easily spilled, and wide enough to dip a pen into. The ink inside would need to be protected from drying out too quickly or from contamination. These humble ink pots were the reservoirs of knowledge, holding the potential for words to last for generations. Ultimately, the ink, whether used for imperial decrees, trade records, indigenous scripts, or religious texts, was more than just a coloured liquid. It was the physical manifestation of ideas, the medium that transformed transient thoughts into permanent records. It was the product of human ingenuity working with the natural world, a blend of craft, science, even if not formally recognised as such, and necessity. And in the quiet concentration of a scribe carefully mixing soot and gum, preparing to write, you see a practice that connects West Africa not only across its own vast landscapes, but back through time to the earliest human attempts to make the invisible visible, the ephemeral lasting. The ink was the history waiting to be written. You've learned how that deep, rich black ink was conjured from soot and gum Arabic, a testament to resourcefulness and craft. But ink, however perfectly mixed, is just potential until it meets a surface. Imagine having the best ink in the world but nowhere to put it. You need something stable, something that will hold the ink, something that won't just crumble or wash away. So let's turn our attention from the liquid in the pot to the canvas beneath the pen, the incredibly varied surfaces that carried the weight of West African words and ideas through time. Just like the ink materials, the writing surfaces available were often dictated by the environment. In a region spanning vast savannas, forests, and coastal areas, you weren't going to find a one-size-fits-all solution. People used what was around them, adapting natural materials with ingenuity. This is where you really see the connection between the writing system and the ecological landscape. One of the most fundamental and widely available surfaces was wood. Not just any wood, of course. You needed pieces that could be smoothed sufficiently to take ink. Wooden tablets, perhaps carved or planed flat, served as temporary or even semi-permanent writing surfaces. Imagine a young student practicing their script, painstakingly forming characters on a wooden board coated with a thin layer of something like clay or sand, which could then be erased or washed off for reuse. These were the original reusable notebooks, way before iPads and styluses. Cheaper, probably smelled nicer after rain, and definitely less likely to run out of battery. For more durable records, treated wood or even sections of bark from certain trees could be used. Bark specifically offers an intriguing possibility. Some types of bark are relatively smooth and can be peeled in sheets. With some preparation, perhaps drying, pressing, or even some form of treatment to make it more flexible and less prone to cracking, bark could serve as a writing surface. Think of scrolls or tablets made from the outer skin of a tree. The texture might be uneven, knotty in places, but it's a natural parchment of sorts, ready to receive the carbon ink. Then there were animal skins. Preparing leather, vellum, or parchment is a much more involved process than stripping bark or smoothing wood, but it results in a highly durable and flexible writing surface known throughout history. In regions where livestock was plentiful, animal hides could be scraped clean, stretched and treated with lime or other substances to create a surface that is smooth, strong, and takes ink beautifully. These surfaces, often referred to generically as parchment or vellum, depending on the preparation and the animal, could last for centuries, even millennia if stored properly. This is the stuff of ancient manuscripts that survive in arid climates. Imagine the smell of treated hide, slightly earthy as you lean in to write on it. It's a very different sensory world from the crisp smell of paper. Using animal skin wasn't just about having a surface, it was about investing significant labour and resources into creating something meant to last. A single hide could be transformed into many pages, but the process from raw skin to usable writing material was time-consuming and required specialised knowledge. It wasn't something you'd do for a quick note or a shopping list. This was for important documents, legal agreements, historical records, religious texts, literary works. Let's slip in a mainstream historical fact here. While paper became the dominant writing surface globally after it spread from Asia, treated animal skins, parchment and vellum were the premier writing material in many parts of the world, including parts of North Africa, and, through trade and scholarship, influencing practices in West Africa, particularly for long-lasting and important manuscripts before paper became widely available and affordable. The University of Timbuktu libraries, for instance, housed many manuscripts on parchment, some dating back centuries. Now for a quirky tidbit. Some traditional communities in various parts of the world, not exclusively West Africa, but worth noting the ingenuity, even use surprisingly resilient materials like large dried leaves, like palm leaves treated in specific ways, or flattened sections of bone or ivory for inscriptions or short messages. While perhaps not for extensive script writing in the sense of a book, these examples show the incredible human capacity to find anything that can hold a mark and turn it into a medium for communication. Imagine trying to write a novel on a stack of palm leaves. Definitely gives turning a new leaf a different meaning. Historians still argue whether the knowledge and techniques for preparing high-quality parchment were developed independently in certain West African regions or were primarily introduced through contact with North African and Middle Eastern scholarly traditions. While the materials, animal hides, were local, the precise chemical and physical processes for creating fine, smooth parchment require specific expertise. The extent of purely indigenous development versus the adaptation of external technologies remains an open scholarly debate. Paper, of course, was a game-changer. Originating in China, paper-making technology spread westward, reaching the Middle East and North Africa relatively early, and eventually filtering down into West Africa through the trans-Saharan trade routes. Paper arrived as a precious, often expensive commodity, carried across the desert by caravans. Initially, it was likely reserved for important correspondence, scholarly works, and religious texts, accessible primarily to rulers, wealthy merchants, and scholars. Early paper arriving in West Africa might have been quite different from the paper you use today. It was handmade, often from plant fibers like flax or hemp, or even recycled rags. The quality varied from coarse and thick to surprisingly fine and smooth. Imagine paper with visible fibers, perhaps slightly uneven edges, but with a surface that takes ink beautifully if the ink viscosity is just right. Holding a piece of this early paper would be a tactile link to centuries of trade and knowledge exchange. The arrival of paper didn't immediately replace other surfaces. For everyday notes, practice, or purposes where permanence wasn't critical, wood or bark likely remained common. Parchment continued to be used for high-value documents due to its proven durability. The choice of surface became another layer of meaning in the writing process. Using expensive imported paper or labor-intensive parchments signaled the importance and intended longevity of the text. Think about the challenges of writing on these different surfaces with homemade ink. On smooth parchment, the ink would glide, allowing for fine strokes and detailed characters. On rough bark, you might need a slightly thicker ink and a firmer hand, the characters needing to be pressed into the texture. On some types of paper, if the ink was too thin or the paper too absorbent, the ink might bleed outwards, blurring the lines. Scribes weren't just writers, they were material scientists, constantly adjusting their technique and potentially even their ink based on the surface they were working with. It's a level of engagement with materials we rarely experience with our uniform, mass-produced notebooks and pens. The preparation of the surface could be as critical as the ink itself. For wooden tablets meant for reuse, applying a thin layer of clay or wax could provide a temporary erasable surface. For more permanent surfaces like parchment or paper, preparing the surface might involve smoothing it with a stone or bone, or even applying a thin coating like a sizing agent to make it less absorbent and prevent ink from bleeding. These preparatory steps were part of the craft, skills passed down alongside the knowledge of writing the script itself. Imagine the sensory details again, the smooth, almost waxy feel of well-prepared parchment, the rough fibrous texture of bark or coarse handmade paper, the distinct scent of each material, dry wood, treated hide, plant fibers. As you dip your reed pen into the ink and touch it to the surface, there's a slight resistance, a whisper of friction as the liquid is absorbed or rests upon the material. It's a symphony of touch, sight, and smell, all part of the act of writing. Consider the scale. While impressive libraries of parchment and paper manuscripts existed in centres like Timbuktu, what about the writing happening in smaller villages for local needs? Simple wooden boards for teaching or accounting, perhaps pieces of calabash gourd with inscriptions or designs written on walls. The forgotten writing systems weren't confined to formal durable media. They likely existed on ephemeral surfaces too, serving immediate needs, teaching, record-keeping, communication within a small community. These everyday uses on perishable materials are much harder for archaeology to recover, making the surviving manuscripts on more durable surfaces all the more precious, though potentially giving us an incomplete picture of the full extent of literacy. The economic implications of these surfaces are also worth noting. While local materials like wood and bark were relatively accessible, preparing them for writing still required labour. Parchment involved not just labour but also the resource of animals. Imported paper was a luxury item, subject to the vagaries of long-distance trade, political stability along the routes, and fluctuating prices. The choice of writing surface was intertwined with economic status and the value placed on the content being recorded. Writing on paper wasn't just writing, it was a statement of importance or wealth. The tools for preparing these surfaces also varied. Knives for shaping wood or reeds for pens, scrapers and stretching frames for animal hides, smooth stones for burnishing surfaces, mortar and pestles for grinding pigments and gums. Each tool, simple as it might seem, was part of the technological ecosystem that supported writing. They represent human ingenuity applied to the challenge of translating thought into a physical, lasting form. Looking at the history of writing surfaces in West Africa is like looking at a cross-section of its history, its deep roots in indigenous materials, its economic connections through trade, its intellectual exchange with other parts of the world. The Vai script, for example, was recorded on paper, but likely also on wooden boards for teaching or other local uses. The Nako script, developed much later, benefited from the wider availability of paper, but was also applied to textiles and other media. The script and the surface were partners, each influencing the other and shaping the final form of the written word. The transition to paper had significant effects. It made writing potentially more accessible, as paper eventually became cheaper than parchment, lighter to transport, think bundles of paper sheets versus bulky parchment scrolls or wooden boards, and offered a smoother, more consistent surface for writing. This facilitated the spread of literacy and the production of texts on a larger scale. But it also meant a gradual shift away from the older, indigenous skills of preparing local materials for writing. It's easy to take our modern writing surfaces for granted, the seemingly infinite supply of paper, the glowing screens of our devices, but stepping back into history you see the effort, the craft, the connection to the natural world that went into creating the very surface you would write upon. It wasn't just a blank slate, it was a prepared medium, carrying its own story of origin and purpose, ready to receive the ink and carry the weight of history, poetry, lore, or a simple message across time. So, you've got your surface ready. Maybe it's a smooth piece of wood, perhaps some carefully prepared bark, a sheet of parchment that smells faintly of the animal it came from, or even a precious, slightly rough piece of the imported paper. You've mixed your ink, maybe the rich deep black from soot and gum arabic we talked about earlier, or perhaps a reddish brown from plant dyes. Now you need the bridge between your thoughts and the page, the instrument that will carry the ink and form the characters. You need a pen. In many historical contexts, before the widespread availability of metal pens, the primary writing tools were reeds, quills, or brushes. In West Africa, reeds were likely the most common and readily available material for making pens. Think about the tall, hollow stems of various grasses or bamboo-like plants that grow near water sources. These natural tubes offer a structure that can be easily shaped into a pen nib. Making a reed pen is a simple but skilled process. You select a piece of reed, not too dry, not too green. You cut it to a comfortable length, something easy to hold, maybe 6 or 8 inches. Then comes the crucial part, shaping the tip. Using a sharp knife, perhaps made of iron, or even a sharpened stone in earlier periods, you cut the end at an angle, creating a slant. Then, from the centre of that slant, you make a slit running back up the shaft a short distance. This slit is absolutely essential. It allows the ink to flow down the channel you've created when you dip the tip into the ink pot. Without the slit, the ink would just sit on the surface of the tip or drip off haphazardly. It's a bit like trying to drink soup with a fork, and technically possible, but profoundly inefficient and messy. Different reeds produce different pens. Some reeds are harder, giving you a finer, sharper point suitable for delicate scripts or smaller characters. Others might be softer, yielding a broader tip better for larger, bolder strokes. The scribe would likely have a collection of pens, perhaps tailored for different tasks or different sizes of writing. It's the ancient equivalent of having a set of fine liner pens, calligraphy brushes, and a Sharpie all made from grass. The angle of the cut on the tip also still affects the line width and how the ink flows. A steeper angle might give you a sharper point, while a shallower angle produces a broader tip. The length and depth of the central slit also matter. They control the ink flow. Too short and the ink barely comes out. Too long and it might gush out, creating blots. Getting it just right requires practice and a feel for the material. A skilled scribe wasn't just someone who knew the script, they were also a craftsman who could select and prepare their tools perfectly. Imagine sharpening your favourite pencil, but if you mess up, you've just ruined a potential pen. High stakes. Beyond reeds, brushes might also have been used, particularly for applying ink to surfaces with more texture or for creating decorative elements. Brushes could be made from natural fibres, animal hair, or even chewed ends of twigs, depending on the desired effect and the materials available. A brush allows for variation in line thickness based on pressure, similar to how modern artists use brushes for painting. While reed pens lend themselves well to the clear, defined lines of many alphabetic or syllabic scripts, a brush could be more versatile for applying ink to textiles or other surfaces, or for calligraphic flourishes. The act of writing itself with a reed pen was a rhythmic process. Dip the pen into the ink pot, letting the tip soak up the ink and draw it into that crucial central slit. The amount of ink the pen held would dictate how many characters or words you could write before needing to redip. Too much ink, and you risk a blob on the page. Too little, and your line fades out mid-stroke. It's a constant dance between the pen, the ink, and the surface. Consider writing on bark or rough paper. The pen tip would encounter resistance, the fibres potentially catching the delicate slit. You'd need a sturdier pen, perhaps cut from a tougher reed, and a slightly thicker ink to prevent feathering or bleeding into the rough texture. The strokes might need to be deliberate, pressed slightly harder to ensure the ink transfers cleanly. It wouldn't be a smooth glide like writing on modern coated paper. It would feel more like drawing, each stroke a conscious effort. Now, picture writing on smooth parchment or fine early paper. Here, the reed pen would glide more easily. You could create finer lines, more intricate details. The ink would flow smoothly from the slit, allowing for faster writing, though still requiring careful control to maintain consistent line weight and prevent smudging. The sound would be different too. Less of a scratch, more of a whisper across the smooth surface. The technique wasn't just about forming the characters, it was about mastering the interaction between tool, ink and surface. The angle at which you held the pen, the pressure you applied, the speed of your stroke, all these factors influence the final appearance of the writing. Scribes develop their own styles, their own hand recognizable by the shape of the letters, the consistency of the strokes, and the overall flow of the text. Let's weave in a mainstream historical fact here. While the quill pen made from bird feathers became ubiquitous in medieval Europe, reed pens were widely used across ancient Egypt, the Middle East, and parts of Asia for thousands of years, proving their effectiveness and durability as writing tools well before quills or metal nibs became common. Their use in West Africa fits squarely into this ancient tradition of utilizing readily available plant materials for writing. Now, a quirky tidbit. Some accounts suggest that for practicing writing on temporary surfaces like sand-coated wooden boards, students might have used a simple stick or even their finger instead of an inked pen. The stick would just draw lines in the sand, allowing them to practice the shapes without wasting precious ink or damaging a good reed pen. Imagine finger painting your ABCs, but with more historical gravitas and sand, less delicious than edible paint, probably. Historians still argue whether specific cutting techniques for reed pens were standardized across different West African scholarly centers, or if they varied significantly by region and individual scribe. While the basic principle of the slanted tip and slit is universal to reed pens, subtle differences in the angle, length of the slit, and choice of reed material could produce distinct writing effects. The extent to which these variations represent regional traditions versus individual preferences remains an open scholarly debate, often hard to trace from surviving manuscripts alone. The rhythm of writing with a reed pen is inherently slower than using a modern ballpoint or keyboard. Each dip in the ink pot interrupts the flow. The need to maintain the ink flow and manage the interaction with the surface requires focus. This wasn't just about speed, it was about deliberate action, a measured pace that allowed for reflection and care into the transcription or composition. Writing was less about quickly jotting down thoughts and more about the careful, almost meditative process of creating a physical object imbued with meaning. Maintaining the pen was also part of the process. The tip of a reed pen wears down with use, especially on rough surfaces. The slit can become clogged with ink or paper fibers. Scribes would need to periodically trim and reshape the tip of their pens, keeping a sharp knife handy. It's like having to sharpen your pencil constantly, but with a slightly higher chance of accidentally amputating your pen's tongue. Think about the tools of other crafts we've touched upon: the pestle and mortar for grinding ink ingredients, the fire for soot collection, the scraping tools for preparing parchment. The simple knife used to shape a reed pen fits into this ecosystem of tools. It wasn't just a single object, it was part of a set of implements needed to bring written language into being. The size and scale of writing would also influence the choice of tool. For large inscriptions on walls or textiles, a larger, perhaps brush-like tool would be necessary to apply ink or paint more broadly. For fine annotations in the margins of a manuscript, a delicately trimmed reed pen with a sharp point would be needed. The tool was chosen not just for its availability, but for its suitability to the task and the desired aesthetic. The grip on the pen, the way it felt in the scribe's hand, the weight of it, the balance, these physical sensations were integral to the writing experience. It wasn't just about the visual outcome, it was a tactile engagement with the materials. Imagine the slightly yielding feel of the reed, the texture of the surface beneath your hand as you rest it for support, the occasional drag or skip if the ink or surface isn't perfect. The skills required to be a proficient scribe were numerous. Not only did you need to know the script itself, its characters, grammar, and orthography, but you needed mastery over the physical tools and materials. You had to know how to select the best reeds, how to cut and maintain your pens, how to mix your ink to the right consistency for the specific surface you were using, and how to apply the ink with the right pressure and angle. It was a complex craft demanding patience, precision, and a deep understanding of the physical world around you. Consider the teaching of these skills. How did a young person learn to write? They didn't just copy letters from a book. They likely started by learning to make their own simple tools, perhaps practicing the cutting of reeds. They learned how to prepare the basic surfaces, like coating a wooden board with sand. They learned how to mix the simplest inks. And then they learned how to hold the pen, how to dip it, how much ink to take up, and how to make the first strokes. It was a hands-on apprenticeship in the entire process of writing. The design of the scripts themselves was also influenced by the tools. Scripts with flowing curves or thick and thin strokes might be easier to execute with a flexible brush or a reed pen that allows for pressure variation. Scripts with sharp, angular characters might be better suited to a firmly cut reed pen with a consistent point. The evolution of the script and the development of the writing tool were likely intertwined, each shaping the other over time. Think about the state of the pens found alongside ancient manuscripts or in archaeological digs. They can tell us a lot. The type of reed used, the way the tip was cut, the signs of wear, these are clues about the scribe's practices, the tools available in that region, and perhaps even the speed and style of writing. A finely sharpened pen suggests careful work, while a blunted or poorly cut one might indicate haste or lack of skill. The materials used for pens were, for the most part, ephemeral. Reeds dry out, split, and are easily discarded. This is one reason why recovering the full story of writing tools is challenging compared to recovering durable ink pots or stone inscriptions. We often have to infer their nature and use from depictions in art, descriptions in texts, or the characteristics of the surviving writing itself, the width of the lines, the marks left by the pen on the surface. The concept of the pen as a distinct tool, separate from a brush or stylus, became particularly important with the development of scripts that rely on discrete characters formed by controlled strokes. The reed pen, with its relatively firm tip and controlled ink flow, was perfectly suited for this. It allowed for repeatable, consistent characters, essential for creating legible text that could be read by others. The transition to other materials like metal pens, which happened much later in most places, significantly changed the writing experience. Metal pens were more durable, held more ink, and didn't require constant sharpening. But they also offered a different feel, a different interaction with the surface. They facilitated faster writing and different calligraphic styles. But for centuries, the humble reed pen, crafted by hand from a plant stem, was the workhorse of literacy in many parts of the world, including West Africa. So as you drift off, imagine that scribe centuries ago, sitting by a flickering lamp or under the shade of a tree, with their pot of dark ink and their carefully prepared surface. They select a reed pen, perhaps one they cut and shaped themselves earlier that day. They dip it into the ink, listen for the subtle sound as the ink fills the tiny reservoir, and then, with a practiced hand, they bring the tip to the page. The feel of the surface, the flow of the ink, the shaping of each character. It's a physical, tangible connection to the abstract world of language and ideas. Each stroke is a small act of creation, building a bridge from thought to history, preserved on wood, bark, hide, or paper by the simplest of tools. Remember that precious, slightly rough piece of imported paper we mentioned as one of the surfaces you might write upon? Well, unlike the local wood bark or animal hides you could source relatively easily, that paper represented something entirely different. It was a marvel of technology born far away, a testament to long-distance connections and a symbol of wealth and access. It wasn't just a writing surface, it was the writing surface that would eventually revolutionize how knowledge was recorded and shared across the globe, including in West Africa. Paper, as most people know, didn't originate in Europe or Africa. Its birthplace is widely acknowledged to be China, sometime around the 2nd century CE, though there are debates about earlier forms. For centuries, the Chinese kept the process a closely guarded secret. Imagine having the formula for something as transformative as paper, and managing to keep it under wraps for hundreds of years. It's like the ancient equivalent of being the only one with Wi-Fi in the village. Eventually, however, secrets tend to leak. The technology of papermaking slowly began to spread westward, primarily along the Silk Roads. It reached Central Asia, then Persia, and eventually the Islamic world in the 8th century. A key moment is often cited as the Battle of Talis in 751 CE, where Arab forces reportedly captured Chinese papermakers. Whether this story is precisely accurate or more of a convenient legend, the fact remains that papermaking technology took firm root in the Abbasid Caliphate shortly thereafter. Cities like Samarkand became early centers of paper production outside of China. From there, the knowledge and the craft spread rapidly throughout the vast Islamic territories. Paper mills were established in places like Baghdad, Damascus, Egypt, and eventually by the 10th century or so, they were producing paper in North Africa and Islamic Spain. Think about the explosion of intellectual activity happening in these regions during this period: mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, literature, religious studies. Paper provided a relatively cheaper and more abundant alternative to parchment made from animal skin, which was expensive and labor-intensive to produce. Suddenly, books could be copied more easily, libraries could grow larger, and knowledge could, in theory, spread faster. Now, bring that picture back to West Africa. You're in a bustling market town along the trans-Saharan trade routes, maybe somewhere like Sijil Massa on the northern edge, preparing to head south, or perhaps already deep in the Sahel, in a place like Gao or eventually Timbuktu. What goods are highly prized? Gold, salt, perhaps slaves, ivory, and among the most precious commodities making their way south, books. And what are many of these increasingly written on? Paper. The journey of paper across the Sahara was no small feat. Imagine caravans of camels, laden not just with heavy slabs of salt or bags of gold dust, but also with bundles of delicate paper. The desert environment is harsh, extreme heat, dryness, sandstorms. Protecting paper from these elements would have been a major concern. It couldn't just be tossed into a saddlebag. It needed to be carefully packed, perhaps wrapped in protective cloths or skins, stored in sturdy boxes. Each sheet that arrived in a West African city represented not just the labour of its creation, but the immense effort, risk, and expense of its journey across thousands of miles of brutal terrain. This meant that when paper first arrived in West Africa, it wasn't for everyone. It was a luxury good, primarily accessible to rulers, wealthy merchants, and the most esteemed scholars. Writing on paper conferred status. It meant you were part of a network that stretched far beyond your immediate locality, connected to the wider world of Islamic scholarship and commerce. It was the ancient equivalent of flying in business class, expensive, exclusive, and definitely a step up from walking. Before paper, writing surfaces in West Africa would have included things like wooden boards, often covered with sand for temporary practice or inscribed for more permanent records, bark, like the traditional use of bark cloth potentially adapted for writing, or treated hides, parchment, though parchment production is labour-intensive and animal skins were valuable for other uses. These materials had limitations. Wood can be heavy and bulky. Bark might be fragile or uneven. Hides require extensive preparation. Paper, by contrast, was relatively lightweight, could be produced in more uniform sheets, and once you had the technology and materials, potentially scaled up. The arrival of paper, even in limited quantities, significantly impacted the intellectual centres developing in West Africa. Cities like Djenné and especially Timbuktu became renowned as hubs of learning, drawing scholars from across the region and beyond. These scholars needed materials to record their knowledge, teach their students, and copy important texts. Paper, though costly, was far more practical for creating multi-page manuscripts than carving into wood or preparing countless pieces of parchment. Mainstream historical fact time. The city of Timbuktu, particularly between the 14th and 16th centuries, accumulated vast libraries containing hundreds of thousands, perhaps even 1 million manuscripts. While many were religious texts, especially Islamic scholarship, others covered subjects like astronomy, mathematics, medicine, law, history, and literature. The existence and growth of these significant manuscript collections were heavily reliant on the availability of paper imported across the Sahara. These libraries are a concrete testament to the impact of paper on West African intellectual life. The quality of the imported paper would have varied. Early paper wasn't always the smooth, bright white stuff you buy at the store today. It could be yellowish or brownish, perhaps uneven in texture depending on the fibres used, often linen or hemp rags, sometimes bark fibres, and the skill of the paper makers. Some might be rougher, requiring a sturdier reed pen, others smoother, allowing for finer strokes. Imagine getting a delivery of paper today, and some is printer paper quality, some is like brown packing paper, and some feels like fancy art paper all mixed together. Scribes would have adapted their tools and techniques to suit the specific paper that they had available. Using paper also introduced new challenges. It was more susceptible to humidity than wood or hide, potentially attracting insects or moulding in damp conditions. Storage became crucial. Keeping manuscripts dry and protected was essential for their preservation. Libraries needed to be more than just collections. They needed to be climate-controlled in a pre-air conditioning sense, and environments carefully managed to protect their precious paper contents. It's like trying to keep your important documents safe from a leaky roof and enthusiastic termites, but on a much grander scale, with potentially irreplaceable manuscripts at stake. Quirky tidbit. One technique used in some Islamic paper-making centres that influenced the paper arriving in West Africa was sizing the paper surface. This often involved applying a thin layer of starch or animal glue, like gelatin, to the paper. After it was formed and dried, this sizing filled the tiny pores between the fibres, preventing the ink from feathering or bleeding uncontrollably across the surface. Without sizing, ink on porous paper would look terrible, like writing on blotting paper. So that smooth surface feel that allowed your reed pen to glide so nicely. You might have a thin layer of dried animal protein or plant starch to thank for it. Just a little historical grossness for your sleep. Historians still argue whether papermaking technology was ever adopted and practiced locally within the major West African states on a significant scale, or if paper remained almost exclusively an imported commodity. While there's evidence of other crafts thriving, and indigenous knowledge of plant fibres and processing, clear archaeological or textual evidence of large-scale continuous local paper mills is scarce. Some scholars believe small-scale production might have occurred, perhaps using local plant materials, while others argue the complex technology and infrastructure of water-powered mills, common elsewhere in the Islamic world, meant it was more efficient to import from North Africa. The extent of local paper production remains an open scholarly debate awaiting further archaeological or textual discoveries. Think about the sheer volume of effort required to produce a manuscript on paper. First, the paper itself had to be made, potentially thousands of miles away, requiring rags, water, vats, presses, and skilled labour. Then it had to be transported across the desert, a journey of months. Then in West Africa, a scribe had to acquire it, prepare their ink and pens, and spend hours, days, weeks, or even months carefully copying the text. It was an investment of resources and time that speaks volumes about the value placed on written knowledge in these societies. It wasn't just printing a document, it was a monumental undertaking. The process of copying text onto paper allowed for the creation of multiple copies, which was crucial for the spread of education and the establishment of libraries. A single precious scroll could be painstakingly copied onto numerous paper folios, bound into a book, and then potentially used to teach many students or form the basis of a new library collection elsewhere. This capacity for reproduction, while still slow by modern standards, was a significant leap forward compared to methods that relied on carving or single copy creation. The structure of books also evolved with paper. Parchment often came in rolls, scrolls, while paper was more easily cut into sheets, folios, and bound into codices, the book format we are familiar with today. This made manuscripts easier to handle, store, and reference. Imagine trying to find a specific passage in a 50-foot scroll versus flipping through pages in a bound book. Paper facilitated the transition to the codex format, making written knowledge more accessible and organized. Even though paper was expensive, it was often more cost-effective in the long run for creating extensive texts than using vast quantities of animal skins. Think about how many sheep or goats you'd need to produce enough parchment for a single large manuscript. Paper recycled rags and plant fibers, which were arguably more sustainable, provided you had the necessary infrastructure. It was like choosing between buying a handmade leather-bound journal for every note you take or using notebooks made from recycled paper. One is clearly more practical for high-volume writing. The impact of paper wasn't just on religious and scholarly texts. It also facilitated administrative records, legal documents, commercial contracts, and personal correspondence. As states grew and trade networks expanded, the need for written communication and record-keeping increased. Paper, though limited, helped meet this demand, providing a more efficient medium than previous alternatives. The legacy of this era of paper importation and manuscript culture in West Africa is still being uncovered. The hundreds of thousands of manuscripts that survived despite the challenges of climate, conflict, and neglect are a treasure trove of information about the intellectual, religious, social, and economic life of these societies. They stand as a powerful counterpoint to narratives that portray pre-colonial West Africa as lacking in written traditions. While oral traditions were undoubtedly vital, the paper manuscripts demonstrate a sophisticated engagement with written knowledge that was deeply integrated into the fabric of these cultures. So the next time you unroll a piece of paper or turn a page in a book, take a moment to think about its incredible journey. From its origins in distant lands, through complex and dangerous trade routes, arriving as a precious commodity, it transformed the landscape of knowledge in places like West Africa. It allowed ideas to be captured, copied and shared in ways that were previously impossible. It wasn't just paper. It was a medium of memory, a vessel for history, and a silent partner to the reed pens we discussed earlier, together preserving the thoughts and wisdom of centuries past. As you settle deeper into your sleep, picture those delicate sheets, carefully handled, painstakingly filled with ink, carrying the weight of history across the sand and through time. So you've got your writing surface, whether it's that sturdy wooden board, a carefully prepared piece of hide, or that precious imported paper we just talked about. You've mixed your ink. Perhaps that rich black concoction from lampblack soot or the iron gall brew bubbling gently. Now you need the link between the two, the tool that will translate thoughts into visible marks, the instrument that dances across the surface, leaving trails of meaning. You need a pen. In the source text of pre-colonial West Africa, especially in those centres of learning and administration, the primary writing tool wasn't the fancy feathered quill you might picture from old European paintings, at least not exclusively or perhaps even primarily. The workhorse, the reliable friend of the scribe, was almost certainly the reed pen. Think about it. Reeds are abundant in many environments, particularly near water sources like rivers and oases, which often coincided with settled populations and trade routes. They are renewable, relatively easy to harvest, and with a bit of skill can be shaped into a functional writing tool. It's the ancient equivalent of finding a decent stick to write in the dirt, but elevated to a fine craft. Making a reed pen isn't complicated, but it requires practice to get it right. You'd select a suitable reed, typically a hollow stem from certain grasses or canes. It needs to be mature but not too dry or brittle. The best ones were said to have a certain strength and flexibility. You would cut a length, maybe 6 to 8 inches long, something comfortable to hold. Then came the critical part, shaping the tip. Using a sharp knife, and a good knife was essential for a scribe, as important as the pens themselves. You'd cut the end at an angle, creating a slanted point. Then you'd make a slit, a fine cut running down the centre of the point for a short distance. This slit is absolutely crucial. It acts like a tiny reservoir, holding a small amount of ink and allowing it to flow down gradually and evenly as you apply pressure and move the pen across the surface. Without that slit, the ink would either dump out in a blob or not flow at all. It's the simple genius behind the pen tip. Different angles, different lengths of the point, and different slit widths would produce different line thicknesses and styles. A broader, less angled cut might be good for bold, blocky script, perhaps for titles or headings on a wooden board. A finer, sharper point with a narrow slit would be perfect for the delicate strokes needed for intricate calligraphy on fine paper. A skilled scribe wasn't just someone who knew how to read and write. They were also a craftsman who knew how to prepare their tools to achieve the desired effect. It's like being a chef who also sharpens their own knives to perfection. The tool and the craft are intertwined. Imagine you are a scribe in 15th century Timbuktu. The sun is filtering through the open courtyard of a library building. The air is warm, dry. You have a stack of that imported paper before you. Your inkwell sits beside you, maybe a small ceramic pot or a metal container. You pick up a freshly cut reed pen. You dip the tip into the ink, watching the black liquid fill the tiny reservoir created by the slit. You touch the tip to the paper, and with a slight scratchy sound, the ink begins to flow, leaving a dark line. The feel of the reed pen is different from a modern ballpoint or even a fountain pen. It's rigid, but it has a natural give if you press too hard and risk splitting the tip. You have to hold it at the right angle, control the pressure carefully. Too much pressure and the slit widens, dumping ink. Too little and the flow stops. It takes concentration. Your hand might cramp after hours of copying, the muscle memory guiding the precise movements needed to form elegant Arabic script or the symbols of a local script. This brings us to a quirky tidbit about these pens. Because the tips would wear down or split with use, scribes needed a constant supply of sharpened pens and their trusty knife. They didn't just have one pen, they might have several, some prepared for different scripts or purposes, and when a tip was worn you'd simply recut and resharpen it, making the pen shorter and shorter until it was too small to comfortably hold. There wasn't really a concept of disposable pens. They were tools to be maintained and reused until they were used up, like a carpenter using a pencil, until it's just a stub. This focus on maintaining and reusing tools speaks to a different relationship with materials than we often have today. While reed pens were undoubtedly dominant, did they use quill pens? Quills are made from the flight feathers of large birds, typically geese, swans or turkeys. Quill pens require a slightly different preparation process than reeds, including hardening the feather shaft by heating or soaking. Quill pens offer a different feel, more flexible than reeds, and can sometimes hold a larger reservoir of ink depending on how they are cut. Historians still argue whether quill pens were widely used in West Africa, or if their presence was more limited, perhaps introduced later, or confined to specific contexts. Arabic sources mention pens made from reeds frequently, but references to quills are less common in the specific context of West African scribal practices. Some scholars suggest that while the knowledge of quill pens might have existed through contact with North Africa and the Middle East, The local availability of suitable reeds made them the more practical and widely adopted choice. The extent to which quills were adopted in different regions or time periods within West Africa remains an open scholarly debate, awaiting more definitive textual or archaeological evidence. Think about the sounds of a scribal workshop or a library, the soft scratch, scratch, scratch of reed tips on paper or wood, the occasional dip of a pen into the inkwell, maybe a faint clinking sound, the rustle of pages, the quiet murmuring of a scribe reading aloud as they copy to ensure accuracy. It wasn't a silent process, but a symphony of quiet industry focused on the preservation and transmission of knowledge. The act of writing was also a form of meditation, a discipline. Each stroke had to be deliberate. Mistakes were possible, of course, and correcting them on parchment or paper was a careful process, scraping away the ink with a knife or applying a corrective wash, hoping not to damage the surface too much. On a wooden board, you might just smooth over the sand or the wax. It makes you appreciate undo buttons, doesn't it? Imagine writing a 500-page manuscript by hand, and halfway through, you realize you've been using the wrong name for a key character. Oops, that's a lot of careful scraping. Mainstream historical fact, reed pens were the standard writing implement across vast swathes of the ancient and medieval world, including Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, Rome, and the early Islamic world, long before quill pens became widespread in Europe. Their prevalence in West Africa, therefore, connects it to a much broader historical tradition of writing technology that spanned continents and millennia. This wasn't some isolated local invention. It was part of a global, or at least old world, toolkit for literacy. The materials used for pens also had cultural significance. Certain types of reeds might be preferred from specific locations. The craft of preparing the pen itself could be passed down through generations of scribes. It wasn't just about grabbing any old stick. It was about selecting the right material, shaping it with skill, and using it with precision. Let's lighten the mood a bit. Imagine you're a student struggling with your writing practice on a wooden board. Your reed pen keeps catching on the uneven surface, making blobs of ink. Your teacher walks by and sighs, picking up your pen. "Ah," they say, shaking their head. "You've cut the sillet too wide. It's like trying to drink from a bucket with a hole in the bottom." He takes out his knife and with 2 quick, expert cuts reshapes the tip. "Now try and remember," he adds with a twinkle, "a good pen is a happy pen. Or maybe that's just me." Another thought. What if you ran out of suitable reeds? Were there local alternatives? Perhaps sharpened twigs from certain trees? While less durable and less capable of holding ink, necessity is the mother of invention, right? You might have had a backup pen made from something less ideal just in case. It's like keeping a cheap Bic pen around for emergencies when your fancy fountain pen runs out of ink. The relationship between the scribe and their tools was intimate. They spent countless hours together. The wear on the knife, the shortening of the pen, the stained fingers, these were the marks of the trade. Each pen had its quirks. Some might flow better than others, some might make a particularly pleasing sound. A scribe would become attuned to the nuances of their tools, knowing how to coax the best performance out of them. Consider the economic aspect too. While imported paper was a luxury, reeds were relatively cheap or free to gather if you knew where to look. A good knife, however, might be an investment, and the ink components also had costs, whether collected locally or traded for. The overall cost of writing, therefore, varied depending on the surface and the accessibility of the pen materials. A simple student board with a reed pen and cheap soot ink would be far more affordable than copying a text onto imported paper using iron gall ink with a finely crafted pen. The skills associated with pen preparation were not trivial. Getting the angle and the slit just right required a steady hand and a good eye. It was a skill often taught alongside writing itself. Learning to write wasn't just about forming the letters, it was about mastering the entire process, from preparing the surface and ink to crafting and maintaining the pen. Think about the sheer manual labour involved in producing written works. Every character, every word, every page was formed by hand, stroke by stroke, dip by dip. There were no printing presses here. The speed of copying was limited by the scribe's hand and eye, and the reliability of their tools and materials. A large manuscript could represent months or even years of dedicated work by a single individual or a team of scribes. This intensive process meant that written texts were valuable commodities, not just for their content, but for the labour and resources invested in their creation. Owning a manuscript was a significant investment, a tangible symbol of wealth and access to knowledge. And the scribes who produced them were skilled professionals, highly respected in their communities. Let's sneak in another joke. A young scribe is showing off his new extra-long reed pen. An older, experienced scribe looks at it and nods slowly. "Very impressive length," he says dryly. "But remember, it's not the size of the pen, but the flow of the ink that matters." The young scribe blushes, realizing the wisdom is less about the tool and more about the technique. The variety of hands or styles of writing that developed using these tools is also fascinating. Just like different people have different handwriting today, scribes in West Africa developed distinct styles, influenced by regional traditions, personal preferences, and the specific scripts they were writing, like various forms of Arabic script, or the indigenous scripts like Nako or Adinkra, though the latter were often used for different purposes than extensive manuscripts. The pen, while a simple tool, allowed for a wide range of artistic and calligraphic expression. So next time you casually scribble a note or type on a keyboard, spare a thought for the scribe with their reed pen, carefully cutting the tip, dipping it into the ink, and painstakingly forming each character on a piece of precious paper under the African sun. It was a world away from our instant communication, a world where writing was a physical, demanding, and often beautiful craft, reliant on simple natural materials and immense human skill. The pen in their hand was a conduit for history, knowledge, and art scratching its way across the surface of time. So you've mastered the tricky art of cutting that perfect slit in your reed pen. You've mixed your ink, maybe it's the rich black of soot or the slightly metallic tang of iron gall, and you've got your surface ready, perhaps a smooth wooden board carefully covered in sand, or a stack of that precious rustling paper. You dip the pen, feel the ink flow, and begin to write. But what are you writing? What kind of words are flowing from the tip of your pen onto the page or the board? In the thriving centres of literacy in West Africa, particularly cities like Timbuktu, Djenné, and Gao, but also in smaller scholarly communities scattered across the savannas and along the riverways, the written word was used for a surprising variety of purposes. It wasn't just about religious texts, although those were certainly central. Think of the range of writing in any society with widespread literacy: administrative documents, legal contracts, historical accounts, personal letters, scientific treatises, poetry, even magic spells. West Africa was no different, though the emphasis might have been different from what you'd expect. A huge portion of the written material that survives, particularly from places like Timbuktu, is in Arabic. This is because Arabic was the language of scholarship, administration, and religion across much of the Islamic world, including these parts of West Africa which had significant connections to North Africa and the Middle East. You'd find countless copies of the Quran, commentaries on the Quran, hadith, sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad, and works of Islamic jurisprudence. These weren't just dry legal texts, they often included rich discussions, debates, and interpretations that shaped the religious and social life of the communities. But beyond religious studies, there was a vast body of work covering diverse fields. Imagine yourself copying a manuscript on astronomy, carefully drawing diagrams of celestial bodies, the ink slightly smudged from where you rested your hand. Or perhaps you're transcribing a text on mathematics, filling the page with numbers and geometric shapes, the reed pen scratching rhythmically. Medicine was another important subject. Scribes copied texts detailing the properties of herbs, treatments for various ailments, and anatomical knowledge. You might even be writing down recipes, not for dinner, but for complicated chemical processes, like making dyes or, yes, different kinds of ink. Is the ancient equivalent of Googling how to make black ink from plants. History was crucial. Local scholars and scribes compiled chronicles detailing the reigns of kings, important events, genealogies of prominent families, and the history of their cities and regions. These historical texts, like the famous Tarikh al-Fatash and Tarikh al-Sudan from Timbuktu, provide invaluable insights into the political, social, and economic life of the Sudanic kingdoms. They weren't always objective, of course. History is often written by the victors, or commissioned by powerful patrons, but they offer a window into the past that oral traditions, while rich and vital, can't always provide in the same way. Then there were administrative documents. Rulers and administrators needed written records. This could include tax registers, lists of officials, records of land ownership or disputes, trade agreements, and correspondence between different authorities. Imagine being tasked with painstakingly copying down a list of taxable goods collected from a caravan that just arrived, ensuring every camel load of salt or every bolt of cloth is accounted for. Accuracy was key. Nobody wants to accidentally tax the Sultan twice. Legal documents were also common. Marriage contracts, wills, property deeds, court judgments, these were all recorded in writing, providing a level of formality and permanence that reinforced the legal framework of the society. A scribe might be called upon to draft a contract or read one aloud in a legal setting, their literacy making them essential members of the community's legal system. Private correspondence existed too, although much less of this has survived compared to official or scholarly works. Imagine writing a letter to a trading partner in a distant city, discussing prices, quantities, and delivery schedules. Or a scholar writing to another scholar across the Sahara, debating a point of theology, or sharing findings from a scientific text. These letters, when they are found, offer incredibly personal glimpses into the lives and thoughts of individuals. Now for a quirky tidbit. Among the manuscripts discovered in places like Timbuktu are texts that some scholars categorize as magical or esoteric. These aren't necessarily spells in the sense of casting fireballs, but rather texts dealing with astrology, numerology, divination, the properties of amulets, and prayers intended for specific protective or beneficial purposes. You might find intricate diagrams or combinations of letters and numbers believed to hold power. While some might dismiss these as superstition, they were often integrated into a broader worldview that included both religious faith and a belief in the hidden forces of the universe. A scribe might be called upon to create a specific amulet for someone, carefully writing the required verses or symbols onto a piece of paper or parchment to be carried by the individual. It blurs the lines between what we today call science, religion, and magic. So who were the people doing all this writing? They were the scribes. The term scribe might conjure images of anonymous copyists, but in West Africa, scribes, often called malams or ulama, scholars, were highly respected individuals. They were the keepers of knowledge, the administrators, the legal experts, and the educators. Many scribes were also teachers, running schools where they taught young students not only how to read and write, but also the subjects contained within the manuscripts: religion, law, history, science. Becoming a scribe wasn't a quick process. It required years of dedicated study, often starting in childhood. You'd begin by learning the Arabic alphabet and memorizing portions of the Quran. Then you'd progress to grammar, rhetoric, and various fields of knowledge. And crucially, you'd learn the physical craft of writing, preparing the surfaces, mixing the ink, shaping the pens, and copying texts. It was an apprenticeship, often under the guidance of a master scholar. Imagine being a young student, sitting in a courtyard, tracing letters in the sand with your finger, later progressing to a wooden board with washable ink, and finally, if you were lucky and diligent, working with paper and permanent ink. It was a rigorous path demanding patience, discipline, and a sharp mind. Your teacher might be incredibly strict, hitting you with a stick if your penmanship was poor or you made too many mistakes. It was a tough-love approach to literacy. Scribes weren't necessarily attached to a single institution like a modern university. Many were independent scholars who gathered students around them. Others were attached to mosques, courts, or wealthy households. Some travelled, carrying their precious manuscripts with them, teaching and copying wherever they went. They formed networks, corresponding with each other across vast distances, sharing knowledge and texts. This intellectual exchange helped to spread ideas and maintain a sense of shared scholarly community. Historians still argue whether indigenous writing systems were used for the same breadth and depth of subjects as Arabic. While Arabic was the lingua franca of scholarship and administration in the major urban centres, indigenous scripts like Nko, Vai, and others developed later, often in response to external pressures or internal desires to record local languages and traditions. While some fascinating manuscripts exist in these scripts, particularly for Nko, which has a rich literary tradition, the surviving corpus doesn't appear to match the sheer volume or disciplinary range of the Arabic manuscripts from the earlier periods. Historians still debate whether this perceived difference is due to less extensive use in the first place, lower survival rates due to different writing surfaces, less durable materials, or simply less scholarly attention and discovery compared to the well-known Timbuktu collections. It's an open question, prompting ongoing research into what texts might have been created and how widely indigenous scripts were truly employed beyond specific functions like divination or community records. The status of scribes could vary. Some were highly influential advisors to rulers, consulted on matters of law, policy, and religion. Others might be humble copyists, earning a living by meticulously reproducing texts for patrons or for sale. Regardless of their specific role, their ability to read and write set them apart and gave them access to knowledge and power that the majority of the population, who relied on oral traditions, did not possess. Mainstream historical fact: The libraries and collections of manuscripts in cities like Timbuktu, particularly during the height of the Songhai Empire in the 15th and 16th centuries, contained tens or even hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. This rivals or even surpasses the size of many contemporary European libraries and demonstrates the immense intellectual activity and value placed on written knowledge in these West African societies. It wasn't just a few scattered documents, it was a literary explosion. Let's inject a little levity. Imagine a scribe whose specialty is copying long philosophical treatises. He's halfway through a particularly dense argument about metaphysics when his reed pen splits for the 10th time that hour. He sighs dramatically, throws the broken pen down, carefully because reeds aren't free, and mutters, "Honestly, I think this pen is conspiring against me. It clearly doesn't agree with the author's premise." Another potential job for a scribe? Writing letters for those who couldn't write themselves. You might sit in the marketplace, a small inkwell and a few pens at your side, and offer your services. Someone comes up, perhaps a merchant, and dictates a letter to his family back home, or a woman wants to send a message to a relative in another town. You listen, formulate the message, and carefully write it down, maybe adding a standard closing phrase. It's like being a human email service, delivering sentiment and information one slow handwritten word at a time. The physical environment of writing also played a role. Scribes often worked in open courtyards under the shade of a tree or an awning, where the light was good. The soundscape would be different too, the distant calls of the marketplace, the bleating of goats, the rhythmic pounding of millet, all accompanying the quiet scratch of the pen. It wasn't the hushed silence of a modern library. It was integrated into the life of the city. Consider the sheer amount of effort involved in creating a manuscript library. It required not only skilled scribes, but also patrons willing to fund the copying of texts, access to materials, ink, pens, surfaces, and safe places to store the finished works away from fire, insects, and humidity. The existence of these libraries is a testament to a conscious and sustained investment in knowledge and literacy. There's a joke waiting to happen here. A young, eager scribe finishes copying his first manuscript and proudly shows it to his teacher. "Look," he says, "it's perfect, not a single mistake." The teacher peers at it closely, then smiles wryly. "Ah," he says, pointing to a tiny ink blot, "but you forgot the traditional mandatory small imperfection. It proves it was made by human hands, not by jinns." Okay, maybe not a real tradition, but it sounds suitably mystical. The diversity of texts also highlights the complex intellectual landscape of these societies. They weren't isolated cultural islands. They were connected to wider networks of trade and knowledge exchange, bringing in ideas from across the Sahara and integrating them with local traditions and concerns. The manuscripts reflect this synthesis, showing the interplay of Islamic thought with local customs, legal practices, and even beliefs. Finally, the very act of copying was considered a virtuous and scholarly pursuit. It wasn't just manual labour, it was a way of preserving and transmitting knowledge, of engaging deeply with the text being copied, and of honing one's own understanding and skills. A scribe wasn't just a human photocopier. They were an active participant in the intellectual tradition, a link in a long chain of knowledge that stretched back centuries. Their careful strokes, guided by the humble reed pen, preserved the thoughts, histories, and beliefs of generations, allowing us centuries later to catch glimpses of their vibrant world. So you've spent centuries mastering the craft, painstakingly copying manuscripts on law, science, history, and yes, even those fascinating esoteric texts. Libraries are flourishing in cities like Timbuktu, packed with handwritten knowledge, vibrant centres of learning connected by networks of scholars and traders. You've seen the importance placed on the written word, felt the weight of tradition in your hand as you guide the pen. But history, as it tends to do, keeps moving and conditions change. What happened to these flourishing traditions? What led to the decline in the widespread use of some indigenous scripts and the dispersal or neglect of those vast manuscript collections? It wasn't a single event, but a confluence of factors playing out over centuries, much like how forgetting where you put your keys isn't one action, but a series of absent-minded moments. Political instability certainly played a role. Empires rise and fall, centres of power shift, and conflicts disrupt trade routes and settled life. Invasions, internal power struggles, and changes in ruling dynasties could lead to the neglect of scholarly institutions, or, worse, the destruction of libraries and the persecution of scholars. Imagine the fear when a conquering army approaches, and the most valuable things aren't gold or jewels, but the stacks of fragile paper and parchment that hold the accumulated wisdom of generations. People would hide them, bury them, carry them away into the desert or up rivers, hoping to keep them safe. Then came the increasing interaction, and eventually domination, by European colonial powers. Colonial rule introduced new administrative languages, French, English, Belge, Portuguese, and new educational systems that often favoured these European languages and scripts over indigenous ones. The economic structures were reoriented, and the traditional patronage networks that supported scholars and scribes were disrupted. It's a bit like your favourite local bakery suddenly having to compete with a global fast food chain that offers jobs only if you speak their language and bake croissants instead of your amazing local bread. The skills and traditions that were once central could become marginalised. For the indigenous writing systems that developed later, many faced challenges in competing with the already established use of Arabic for widespread literacy in some regions, and then with the imposition of European languages and the Latin alphabet across most of the continent. Some scripts like Vai or Nako continue to be used and are experiencing modern revitalization efforts, which is fantastic, but others, like the intricate Nsibidi symbols used in southeastern Nigeria, often remained more within specific societies or served particular functions, and their historical trajectory was also impacted by colonial dynamics and the rise of new forms of communication. Historians still argue whether indigenous scripts were already in decline before significant colonial contact, or if colonialism was the primary driver of their marginalization compared to Arabic or Latin scripts. It's a complex chicken and egg situation with many local variations. Preservation itself is a monumental challenge in tropical and subtropical climates. Paper and parchment are delicious snacks for insects like termites and silverfish. Humidity encourages mold and rot. The dry heat of the desert can make paper brittle and crack. Fires, common accidents in past eras, were a constant threat to buildings full of combustible material. Imagine a scholar carefully preserving his life's work, only to lose it all because a spark from a cooking fire landed on the roof. It's heartbreakingly easy to lose written history. So these precious manuscripts, the culmination of centuries of scholarly effort using that carefully prepared ink and those finely cut reed pens, were vulnerable. Many were lost to time, climate, and conflict, but many, perhaps thousands, were hidden, tucked away in family homes, buried in jars in the ground, concealed in mosque libraries that fell into disuse, or spirited away to safer locations during times of trouble. Fast forward to the late 20th and 21st centuries. There's been a growing global awareness of the importance of these forgotten or overlooked intellectual traditions. Scholars, local communities, and international organizations have launched efforts to find, preserve, study, and digitize these surviving manuscripts. The story of the Timbuktu manuscripts in particular is a dramatic one. During times of conflict and instability in Mali, dedicated individuals and families risked their lives to smuggle thousands of manuscripts out of the cities, hiding them in the villages and safer locations to protect them from destruction. It's the ultimate historical cliffhanger, where the heroes aren't soldiers but librarians and scholars stuffing ancient books into right sacks and donkey carts under the blissful cover of darkness. These modern preservation efforts face immense challenges. Many manuscripts are fragile, damaged by time and conditions. Funding is often limited. The sheer volume of material requires extensive work to catalogue, conserve, and digitize. And there are ethical debates about ownership, access, and whether manuscripts should remain in West Africa or be held in institutions abroad. Historians still argue whether the best place for preservation and study is in situ or in well-equipped international labs. But the work continues. Digital projects are making these texts accessible to scholars around the world, opening up new avenues for research into West African history, religion, science, and culture. They reveal a world that was far from illiterate or lacking in intellectual depth before significant European contact, a mainstream historical fact that these manuscripts powerfully demonstrate. They show complex societies with sophisticated legal systems, deep religious engagement, scientific curiosity, and a strong sense of their own history. A quirky or fringe tidbit. Among the manuscripts hidden and saved from Timbuktu were not just the expected religious and legal texts, but surprising items like records of Misir, treatises on astronomy with diagrams of constellations identifiable from the Sahara, and detailed descriptions of medicinal plants and surgical procedures. It shows the incredibly broad scope of what was considered worth writing down and preserving. You might even find a manuscript that looks suspiciously like ancient business accounts, detailing shipments of salt and gold, proving that even balance sheets can become historical treasures if you wait long enough. So what is the legacy? It's multifaceted. Firstly, these manuscripts are a direct refutation of the colonial era myth that Africa south of the Sahara had no written history or complex intellectual traditions of its own. They are tangible proof of sophisticated literacy and scholarship existing for centuries. Secondly, they are invaluable sources for understanding the history of West African societies, their connections to the wider world, and the lives of the people who lived in them. Thirdly, they offer insights into the history of ideas, showing how knowledge from different traditions, Islamic, local African, was integrated and developed. Finally, for communities where indigenous scripts are still used or being revived, these traditions are a source of cultural pride and continuity, linking the present to a written past that predates or existed alongside colonial impositions. Let's lighten the mood a bit. Imagine a modern conservator carefully cleaning a manuscript, maybe using tiny brushes and special solutions. They lean in close, trying to decipher a faded passage, and sneeze. A tiny cloud of ancient dust poofs up. Ugh, they think. Pretty sure that dust is older than my entire family tree. At least I didn't sneeze on the manuscript. Small victories. Another joke opportunity? Consider the sheer volume. If you had to digitize all the known West African manuscripts by yourself, starting today, let's just say you'd need a lot of coffee, and probably a very comfortable chair, and maybe a pet chameleon to keep you company, because that would take forever, even for a speed typist. Think about the ink we discussed earlier, the soot-based ink, the iron gall ink. Imagine how durable it had to be to survive centuries in these challenging conditions, sometimes buried or hidden away. It's a testament to the skill of those ancient ink makers. They weren't just mixing coloured liquid, they were creating a substance meant to defy time and the elements. Maybe they muttered a little incantation over the ink pot. Be strong, ink, resist the bugs and the damp, carry these words through the ages. Probably not, but it adds a nice, slightly mystical touch to the chemical process. The story of these writing systems and their inks is far from over. It's a story of innovation, scholarship, loss, preservation, and rediscovery. It's a reminder that history is everywhere, often hidden in plain sight, waiting for us to look closer, to listen to the rustle of fragile paper, and to appreciate the simple, profound act of putting ink to surface. It connects us across centuries, showing that the desire to record, to teach, to remember, and to understand is a deeply human one, shared by scholars in ancient mud-brick cities, and by you, listening now. As you drift deeper into relaxation, let the images of those ancient scribes fade gently. The scratch of the reed pen on paper, the deep black ink drying on the surface, the quiet hum of a courtyard filled with the pursuit of knowledge. The journey through West Africa's forgotten scripts and their inks draws to a close. The rustling of ancient papers softens. The scent of iron gall ink grows fainter. The faint echoes of scholars debating fader. You've travelled fit tonight, across continents and centuries, exploring worlds perhaps previously unknown to you. Allow the details to soften around the edges, like old ink bleeding slightly on aged parchment. There's no need to hold on to the facts or the debates now. Let the gentle rhythm of the story lull you. Your own world is quiet now, safe and warm. The historical journey is complete, the narratives tucked away like precious manuscripts on a shelf. You are here, in the present, preparing for rest. Release any lingering thoughts of ancient inks or hidden libraries. Let the subtle sounds of the night take over, guiding you softly towards sleep. There is only the comfort of your space, the quiet settling of your body, and the promise of peace. Just breathe softly, release the day, and allow yourself to sink into deep, peaceful rest. The stories will be here tomorrow. For now, just sleep.